Good morning. Welcome to, I don't know how many meetings of this council we've had. It'd be interesting to be able to number them, the whatever meeting of the monitoring council. But since we don't know, I'll just say welcome to the September 2018 council meeting. Take a minute to go over the agenda, and then we'll get into, well, maybe we should do introductions first. For those of you here in the building, just logistics-wise, there are restrooms out in the hallway. The ladies' room is right across, and the men's room is all the way down the hall to the left. There's a cafeteria downstairs on the first floor if you want some coffee or water or snacks. If we get an emergency evacuation signal, we gather in Cesar Chavez Park on 10th and J on the corner over there, so you can join us for the all clear if you'd like, or you can go grab coffee, whatever you'd like to do. So we're scheduled to go till about 3 today, and I'll go over the agenda in a minute. So why don't we go ahead and do introductions. My name is Karen Mogus. I am the co-chair of the Monitoring Council representing Cal EPA.
Good morning. I'm Taryn Ravazzini, the co-chair representing the California Natural Resources Agency. I am with the California Department of Water Resources.
Hi, I'm Ken Schiff, and I'm the alternate council member for the scientific community. I'm from the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project.
I'm Helen Papanides. I'm the alternate for the member representing Citizen Science.
And I'm Beth Chrisman, and I'm the member for Citizen Monitoring Group.
And the Assistant Director for the Monitoring Council.
Nick Martirano, Director for the Monitoring Council.
Terry Fleming, EPA Monitoring Council Liaison.
Bruce Haudel, Sac Valley Water Quality Coalition, alternate for agriculture.
Ray Heimstrom, member for the public.
Shelley Walther, I'm representing the regulated community, POTWs, and I'm with LA County Sanitation District.
And hopefully you all on the phone can hear us. Was that me? That was me twice, I guess. Those of you on the phone, introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Susie Thoreau with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project.
Anyone else on the phone? All right, then I will proceed with going over the agenda. We'll start with, already did introductions and a little bit of housekeeping. We'll go over the notes from the May 30th council meeting, and then we'll go on to public forum. If anyone from the public has anything they'd like to address the council on that's not already on the agenda, that's your opportunity to do that. And we'll go over some announcements and updates on a number of items. Then we're going to spend the rest of the morning getting updates on the Monitoring Council subcommittees that have met since the May 30th council meeting. And then depending on how long that takes, we may continue that item after lunch and then turn our attention to a project that the Nature Conservancy, along with Department of Fish and Wildlife, have been working on, the Freshwater Blueprint, and then round out the day with the meeting agenda for the next meeting that's scheduled on November 29th. Any comments about the agenda, any adjustments that you'd like us to make? All right, then with that, we've already done introductions. We've already reviewed the agenda. So draft meeting notes from May 30th. Any comments on the notes? Go ahead, Chris.
So there was only one minor edit, which Shelley had pointed out, that instead of referring to the Safe to Eat work group and portal, it was Safe to Swim as an error on the agenda or the notes. So that was modified, but that was the only feedback that we received.
Any other edits from anyone that's read them? Hopefully you've reviewed them.
My only other edit that I just noticed is that it's still called agenda rather than notes, so I will make that change.
Sounds good. So with that, let's go ahead and take a vote on approving the notes from the May 30th meeting. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Approved. Just as another note, I don't know if this is in the announcements or not. I don't see it. So I just wanted to make mention that our plan moving forward with the notes from the meetings are twofold. One is we'll record and document all of the action items and decisions that have been made, but the meetings also will begin to be recorded. Are we being recorded today?
Yes.
Should have notified everybody of that. We're all being recorded. And we'll make the recordings also available as part of the notes for anyone that wants to go back and listen to the discussion, but we're going to make the notes relatively simple and focused on just actions and decisions for the most part, unless there's any opposition to that. Making it the discussion available because we can, if people want to go back and look at it.
Because it's a public meeting, and if people can't attend, it provides a better record of how the meeting went.
I go back and look at board meetings all the time on YouTube. All right, then with that, we'll move on to public forum. Anyone have any comments about something that's not already on the agenda? I like chairing meetings and making them go quickly. This is good. We're already 10 minutes ahead of time. All right, then let's move on to announcements and updates. The first one is on AB 1755. Nick, you have an update for us.
Thanks. Yes, so the major update with AB 1755 is that they were trying to develop some trailer legislative language to create a advisory council that would be charged with developing the governance for how AB 1755 will be implemented. That legislative language has not been attached to any bill as of yet, although it is still being shopped around. But the main gist of the changes were to develop what they're calling an advisory council made up of member agency teams as well as the public. It looks very similar to actually what this council is made up of, to help create how will be implemented, with the idea that it'll include private and public entities, and because they have a funding mechanism that's primarily donation-based, that it may need to be a nonprofit or 501(c) type of organization with state representation, but also allowing for that philanthropic kind of representation as well as private interest. Even though that the language it has not been attached directly to any bills at this time, the partner agency is moving forward in that direction regardless, and is looking to develop this council to create the governance for AB 1755. Also, from the Water Board's perspective, in July, a open data and transparency resolution was passed on July 10th at the board meeting, which ties heavily into the Water Board's implementation of AB 1755, and includes the creation of a data management strategy, as well as an inventory of the Water Board specific data systems, and kind of identifying what it's going to take to bring our disparate systems up to open water data standards, and actually define what open data means, what it goes into making something open, as well as outlining kind of the training necessary for data literacy, et cetera. So that really helps us define goals at the water boards, with that coming up in March for the inventory to be due, as well as a follow-up with the board meeting. But other than that, that's my update on AB 1755. Any questions? Thanks.
All right, thanks, Nick. So then we have Susie Thoreau on the phone, and she's going to provide us an update on the molecular methods work group.
Great, thanks. All right, and Well, thanks you guys for giving me the opportunity to provide an update, and I just wanted to, in advance, say thank you to Nick and Chris and Nicole Hack, who all helped draw up the charter that I'll just be walking through with you guys, and also just brainstorm kind of what we wanted this molecular methods work group to look like. All right, we want to jump ahead to the next slide. So just by a little bit of recap, so the last time that we met, we had presented the idea that we really have a great need right now for a molecular methods work group. And to review briefly some of the big motivations for bringing this group together, we see that molecular methods are becoming increasingly popular. They're really powerful, but right now we have a real lack of clear guidance on some of the best practices for generating this molecular data. And also there's a big need for improved communication among the different researchers that are actually generating that data and then want to take that data and put it into action and use it for policy implications. And so we really think California can be a great leader in establishing these recommendations and guidelines, and a molecular methods work group would really help coordinate all of these different researchers and those that are going to be taking these different methods and putting them into policy applications. And so we think the molecular methods work group would really be a great way to convene this group. And so the next slide just gives you a brief overview of what my charge was over the past couple of months, namely that we wanted to come up with a draft charter document for this new molecular methods work group. And that involved determining the key objectives and potential work group products, and then also some potential structure of the work group, how it would be formatted, and who might be some of the members that would be included. And so then on the next slide, you can just see a snapshot of what this draft charter document now looks like. It was attached to the agenda for today. And as I mentioned, I worked on this in collaboration with Nick and Chris and Nicole. And the main objectives for this molecular methods work group really is to serve as a clearinghouse for the key technical and programmatic guidance for the use of molecular methods. So that's anything that's DNA or potentially RNA related, all sorts of methods that can be used for bioassessment and environmental monitoring programs in California. And so on the next slide, you can see just the three main objectives that we identified. And those are really consensus building, communication, and coordination. So when we're talking about consensus building, we're referring specifically to coming up with some of those recommendations and best practices for everything from soup to nuts with generating DNA data, so that's sample collection, sample processing, and any sort of analytical pipelines. And then also we really like the idea of this working group being able to serve to identify areas for future research. So some of these novel or emerging technologies in the DNA field, this working group could really evaluate them and their utility for environmental monitoring and bioassessment. Communication, as I said, this working group would really just be a great opportunity for different researchers to get their heads together and come up with these recommendations, guidelines, and also be able to advise water quality managers on how to put DNA-based methods into practice. And then coordination, hopefully, this working group would be able to serve as an area where the different research groups could come together and identify areas where they can enhance their collaborations and also help reduce these redundancies that we're seeing in sample collection, where there might be multiple researchers all targeting DNA in the environment, and they can be working better together to be more efficient in the collection of these samples. And so on the next slide, I just wanted to provide a couple of brainstorm ideas for some of the key products that could be coming out of this work group. So some of the first ones could be a primer on molecular methods. We think it would be really important to start at square one and make sure that anyone that could be putting these methods into use in the environment are working with the same vocabulary. So that just involves defining a number of these key concepts or key technologies, so that anyone who's working with them can better understand what we're referring to when we talk about PCR or eDNA or metabarcoding. It would also be a resource for people who are looking to start using these molecular methods, which of these tools would be best for my environmental application. Also something that we've already gotten a jump start on when we sent out a survey to a number of different researchers across California to get a sense of what types of technologies they're employing and where they're collecting DNA. We think that this work group could help come up with an inventory of DNA sampling across the state, and through an online portal be able to provide sort of a map, again, to help coordinate different research efforts and sampling efforts across the state. Of course, one of the key products we see is some recommended field protocols. So how do you go about collecting DNA in the environment? Having everyone using rigorous, robust, refined field protocols really will help ensure that the data that's getting collected is going to be of comparable quality. And likewise, we see some real potential to provide some guidance on how you go about managing the data that you generate through these molecular methods, and also what some of your data should look like in terms of key performance measures to ensure that it's of really high quality. All right, so next slide. We came up with a proposed structure for the molecular methods work group. So this is something I'd really love some feedback from the council on. We liked the idea of potentially having a larger work group that was comprised of key agency and user community members. So that could potentially be people from Swamp, Cal EPA, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, a number of the different key agencies that would be interested in employing these molecular methods, and also driving policy that would be using the molecular data. And so this group would discuss the recommended protocols and some of the sampling requirements with an eye towards implementation. So that's the real big component that this larger work group would focus on. And then there would be a subset of that work group that would be comprised of more of the technical experts. So these would be the practitioners and potentially the academics, so the people that are using DNA in their everyday lives. And so there are a number of different folks that we've already gotten enthusiastic responses from who would be willing to be involved from this technical element, and that included people that are part of the Cal eDNA effort that's led by UCLA, and also some other folks that we work with that are DNA experts. And so the technical work group would really be focused on fleshing out some of those different sampling protocol and analytical methods, and building consensus around the different types of protocols that we would be using for generating this data. And then also they'd be responsible for discussing some of those emerging technologies and their application to environmental monitoring. So as I mentioned, this is kind of just the proposed structure, and so we'd really love to get feedback on if the council feels like this is the best structure for the molecular methods work group. We're open to ideas, and so that's just what we've thrown out there so far. We'd also like to get a sense of what we think about in terms of how membership is determined. Right now, we've been reaching out to key technical experts that we would like to get involved. And in general, should this work group be open to anyone at large, or should it be considered invite only? And lastly, we'd love to get some feedback on any potential organizations, agencies, or personnel that you think should really be involved in this effort. Please feel free to reach out by email to me at any point. And that's it. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I think in working on this charter document, we've gotten really excited about the potential products that this work group could be putting out. So I am grateful for the opportunity, and I'll take any questions.
Hi, Susie. Great presentation. Thank you. This is Shelley from POTWs. I was just wondering the reason for the structure of the larger work group and the smaller technical work group. Seems like the products are mostly technical. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that right now the products that I can definitely see us generating in short order would be focused around some technical elements, specifically with regards to the sampling protocols. Something like trying to get a number of different researchers together. You know, it's really useful to have input from technical members on that, but also some of the different agencies who are more aware of some of these sampling efforts that are happening all across the state, even if they're not the technical experts themselves. But I think further down the line, it'll be especially valuable once we've come up with some of these recommended best guidelines, or we begin to maybe put together some standardized sampling protocols. In terms of getting that into implementation, I think it's really critical to have the input from the regulatory members on what some of those potential logistical roadblocks might be. It's really easy from an academic standpoint to think about what's the best way of doing a sample collection or a sample processing, but when you start to think about that at large-scale implementation, there might be some roadblocks that as technical experts we're just not used to identifying. And so I see the importance of that sort of input maybe a little bit further down the line when we come up with some of these best practices and recommendations, but really need to start thinking about the broad-scale implementation.
So would both work groups kind of meet at the same time together initially, and then if you need like a subcommittee for technical, they would get together for something and come back to the larger work group?
Yeah, I think that would definitely be something that would be open for discussion. First off, it would be great to get the large work group together with the technical experts and brainstorm what some of those priority first products will be, and then the group can kind of set the structure. Maybe it means the technical work group is meeting more regularly because they have a timeline that they're trying to roll out a key product, and then they meet back with a larger work group when they kind of have a product to review.
Thank you.
All right,
this is
any
Chris.
other questions?
Hi. Just kind of relating to Shelley's question, one thing that our work groups often, a model that often works for our work groups is that they have the broader work group, but then form subcommittees as needed. So there may be a specific purpose that a subcommittee may form and maybe even go away after a while. And so that's maybe something where just in terms of getting folks to participate in a group, that's kind of half the battle. And so not necessarily limiting yourself to, whatever participants may want to be involved in a technical work group or a larger work group. If you have the groups open to whoever wants to participate, then that's, often easier to get broader participation and more folks to actually take part. So that's maybe something just to consider also as a potential model.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Great.
Hi, Susie. This is Terry.
Yeah.
I just have one quick question. I mean, and maybe it's not even pertinent, but how is this being funded?
I think this would be funded initially through enthusiasm and dedication. But I think that if this work group, after first initial meetings where we really start brainstorming some of those key products that we want to roll out, I think depending on what those products look like, which ones we choose, we can then take some of those ideas to potential different funding agencies and reach out to different funding options. But initially, I think it will be 100% volunteer basis.
Good morning. My name is Mark Johnson. Is it too late to provide public comment?
Why don't we go ahead and finish this update item, and then we'll return to public forum if you'd like to make some comments. Is that all right?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
This is Bruce out of Shelton. I want to build off of Terry's question. I look back at the minute notes, so I apologize for not being a great student here. Who's the champion of this project? Does it augment an existing program that's already in place, or is it intended to supplement a program that's in place? Does this just deal with inland water bodies, the coast? Does it just deal with fecal and bacteria? Just kind of pressure on that, because look, everybody's got a lot of enthusiasm, but there's only so much bandwidth. Okay, so.
Great. So I can answer the question right now. I am being the ringleader, trying to get this molecular methods work group spun up. And I think in the discussions that we've been having so far, molecular methods are really applicable across water bodies and across environments. And when it comes to some of the technical experts that we've been reaching out to, they have expertise in freshwater and marine and terrestrial sampling. So I think it really could be used, or the products that we're looking to develop could be useful across a broad range of different environments. And that could also include some of the human health component, because a lot of the technologies have overlap with the ones that we use for environmental monitoring. And so I think we're seeing this as an independent work group that would be spun up because it really is a critical need, and so it, I think, is worthy of its own independent work group. But I don't think you're wrong. I think it could be a Herculean effort, and so right now I'm leading the charge, and hopefully we'll have a lot of other enthusiastic souls who will jump on board, who can be contributing along the way.
Thanks, Susie. This is Nick. I'll add to that. The champion on the council has been Steve Weisberg from SCORP in the academic community, and I think it's really a recognition that ties into the top 5 strategy areas that we mentioned in May 30th. One of those being taking advantage of emerging methods, and where we have that kind of fervor behind it to leverage that. We see eDNA coming on the horizon that definitely is going to apply to indicator bacteria, but it's also being actively used for bioassessment as well as by Fish and Wildlife for determining if endangered species are in a certain water body. And we see that as an opportunity as a council to start these discussions that aren't happening as of yet on how can we start collaborating and coordinating our monitoring as we move forward, because we see this becoming something that we are going to be monitoring ourselves and most likely requiring others to monitor. So we thought it would behoove us to coordinate early.
This is Greg Gerhardt, OEMA State Water Board. The water boards are definitely champions of this. State Water Board, Office of Information Management, program in its role, coordinating the monitoring for the key supporters of this work group. And I would say, with or without the council, which I'm really glad that the council is stepping up with Steve Weisberg's, we'll be doing this. We have staff dedicated.
Awesome.
Susie, this is, Bruce, did you want to follow up? Or?
Yeah, I always like to follow up with Greg. So with the coordination with regional boards throughout, can you expand upon that? I mean, are they aware of this is going on?
Yeah, so the SWAMP program has been looking at eDNA and partner agencies. We've been talking about this. We've been hosting discussions, and one of the recognitions about a year ago when we had a meeting really isn't a standard way to collect it. That was one of the first little nuggets of crystallization that happened about the development side, which the method development. How do you make use of this? And so, the thing that was talking about data standards included.
Susie, this is Taryn Ravizini. I want to first thank you for the presentation and definitely for your enthusiasm. I'm not used to it as a funding source, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how this goes. One thing with relation to the feedback, I actually have kind of more of a question for the folks here in terms of how we have if we have a protocol for pulling together the membership of the work groups. How have we done that in the past? I think because she's looking for feedback, and I didn't know if we have like a protocol or a process in place. I'm not as familiar with that, and maybe Nick or Chris might be able to just elaborate in terms of the request for feedback.
So we don't necessarily have a protocol for membership. Typically, our work groups are all open to whoever wants to participate. So it could be agency folks, it could be people in the private sector, and it's just whoever would want to take part. Because especially with this effort, it's not just agency folks who are doing this type of monitoring, but there are also private sectors that are involved in as contractors working for different agencies as well. So, or other kind of groups that may be doing this type of research and monitoring. So, so really for this effort, it was, it's open. So that's, I guess, to answer her second question for feedback, I would say, leave it open to whoever would like to take part. And as the council, just more generally, we getting participation is one of the biggest challenges that we get. So the more the merrier. So that's what I would.
And if I could just follow up, Susie, really quick, I may have missed, so if this is repetitive, please forgive me. The timeline with which you're kind of focusing your attentions on what you're doing from your end, but then also how you want to be working with the council? What is your timeline?
I think we haven't really discussed a timeline previously. I think the first hurdle we wanted to get over was having a charter that we all agreed on. When I'm thinking about it, I like the idea of if this work group can be assembled and really start to turn out its first product within a year. I don't think that's too unrealistic. So that's what I've been thinking about, but I think that's something that we'll definitely be discussing with the council, hopefully as we get moving.
I think to follow up on Taryn's question, I think that there's two different types of work groups. There's ones that existed pre-council that were kind of brought in under the umbrella, and then there's new work groups that are kind of a newer territory for us. The most one that pops to my head is the environmental flows work group, which is recently being brought in and being worked on in a very similar fashion, where they have a technical working group of academics that provide an objective view of how data should be standardized. And then we have the group of regulatory and regulated folks to come in and talk about and discuss how those can be properly implemented and coordinated across agencies on a statewide level. So I see very much similarity between those two work groups. As far as process, I see it as, as we did May 30th, we came to the council with an idea. There seemed to be some support from the council, so we followed up, okay, we'll develop a charter, start following the steps for creating a work group. And Susie has a good handle via the survey on creating the technical pieces, but I think where we might need the council's help, which I think might be the ultimate question, is how can the council help with this effort, is identifying participants of this larger work group, whether that be from your sectors or from stakeholders across both the regulated entities and the regulators, as well as the public that might be interested in helping to populate this work group and make it as viable as possible by getting participation in identifying those characters. So I think part of this presentation was to get the council members thinking about, okay, here's some of the products we're thinking of creating. Are there staff members or resources that you have in your sectors that you think should be participating or could be participating to help the effort, so that can reach out to Susie, and then we can start really building out the work group itself, finalize the charter, then you develop the timeline, who's responsible for what, and then as those products come out, they get published on our website, and then they become, victories, for the council itself.
Any other comments or questions for Susie? Go ahead, Ken.
So this is Ken. Taryn, just to address your comment, I'm just going to make the suggestion that council seems to be generally, both with this meeting and then I gather from the previous meeting, to move forward with this work group. And we don't seem to have a problem too much with the charter, the draft charter that's been put together. Why don't we challenge Susie to hold her first meeting before our next meeting?
Great.
Within a week or 2 weeks, we provide her all the names we think are appropriate so she can invite them to that first meeting. And then, not that she needs to approve her charter at her first meeting, but that would be a good time for her to come back to us with which are their priority products and a rough time frame from which we can expect them.
Susie, this is Terry again. I know that there are folks at EPA are engaged in this, and I know they're not in California, but are you involved with them, and would you consider them part of this work group, or could they be part of this work group?
Yeah, so we work with a number of different folks at EPA who are focused on developing molecular approaches, specifically for bioassessment in particular. And I think they would be great to have as members of the work group. I would maybe throw it back to the council how they feel about having people from outside California being included. But I would be happy to, if that sounds like something the council is comfortable with, I'd be happy to reach out to a number of our different collaborators and contacts at EPA across the U.S.
This is Ray Heimstra. So I just What about, including people from out of state? My understanding is that the only commercial lab right now that's certified for this is in Florida. So I'm not sure if you're working with them, but I know when we do samples, they have to go to Florida. So just
okay. Okay, that's great. I'll follow up on that.
That's Source Molecular. I can put you in touch with them if you like.
Okay, great.
And I'll answer the out-of-state representation. We have several work groups, especially on the technical side. The Biological Oversight Committee is one that comes to mind, where we have representatives from Minnesota all across the state. As far as expertise is considered, we don't need to bound ourselves to California's borders.
Okay, great. Okay, that's super useful.
So my only feedback has to do with an item coming up later where we talked previously about terminology for subgroups versus committees versus subcommittees versus whatever teams. I would just recommend that when that starts to solidify, that we dive it with your charter language, so that, for example, what is a standing thing versus what is a ad hoc thing that it has a project-specific endpoint. Whatever the terminology we decide upon, let's just make that work, because I do recognize that you have different layers and different needs of different groups, but we haven't decided yet as a.
So unless there's any other comments or questions, I think I'll reiterate the suggestion that Ken made, which was to direct Susie to hold her first meeting of the work group before our next meeting, which is scheduled on November 29th, I believe. And for us as a council and anyone else that happens to have some contacts that might be relevant, to provide those names to Susie within the next couple of weeks. So today is the 5th, so that, easy for me to say. So 2 weeks out would be what, the 21st? No, that's further out. 19th, the 19th. So we'll provide Susie with any input by then, and we'll expect a report back on at our meeting in November.
Great. I like it.
Great. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on, still on the announcements and updates, there's a new item we've added to...
Karen,
oh, yes.
Do you want to go back to the public forum?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, we do want to go back to the public forum. So the gentleman on the phone, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Yes, good morning. My name is Mark Johnson. I appreciate the opportunity to make public comment. I tried to get on earlier, but had some difficulties. I live in the Coachella Valley. I'm a retired water resource professional. And as you're aware, we are home to California's largest lake, the Salton Sea, which is in dire straits. The only input to the Salton Sea is agricultural drainage and partially treated municipal wastewater. And after the end of last year, the mitigation water from the QSA, the Quantitative Settlement Agreement, ended. So the sea is now really starting to shrink. There's only one species of fish left. Most of the birds that eat fish have left the area, so it's not a very pretty picture. The Salton Sea Management Program is in play. However, it's delayed. The phase 1 process is delayed, and they haven't even started work on the long-term solution, which could be ocean to sea transfer of water. But that's going to be probably decades before that comes about. The other part of the solution here is the water quality entering the Salton Sea. It has been very, very little attention to that over the years. Agriculture is now, beginning in 2014, required to monitor the water quality coming out of the agricultural drains in the Coachella Valley and the Imperial County. So we are starting to get some data. So I was just hoping that your group, your committees here could include the Salton Sea watershed as a very, very important water resource that needs to be monitored very, very closely because of the issues that occur here. So that's basically my public comment. I'm not sure how it could be folded into your program, but hopefully it can be. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I understand that you've been in contact with Nick Martirano directly, our director of the council, and he's given you some information about what the council does and our focus areas. Nick, is there a follow-up that we should identify here?
I pointed out to Mark that generally speaking, the council is focused on theme-specific work groups, things like safe to swim, safe to eat, as well as general water body types like estuaries, wetlands. And due to the specificity of the Salton Sea as an inland saline water body, it would be maybe difficult or maybe to develop a work group around it. I'd put him in contact with Jeff Garachi at the Colorado River Regional Water Board, who is the swamp representative and in charge of regional monitoring efforts in the Salton Sea as well as other areas within that region. And I encouraged him to participate in the public forum today to alert you all as council members. Where we take it from here is up to you all, but that's the feedback I provided.
It also would overlap a little bit with the harmful algal bloom topic. I know that we have some sampling events that might be a way to sort of pull out data metrics that relate to water body specific questions, top 5 list, or something. Start thinking about. I know we have a healthy watershed concept. This is not really a watershed as much as it's a water body interest.
Okay, so it sounds like you have some contacts. The Healthy Streams Working Group hasn't met in a while, but I do think that may be the most relevant working group that's in existence to connect with. And so I think we have your contact information. So we'll make sure you get the information when those working groups are meeting, and encourage you to continue to keep this on our radar if it falls off.
And it's not just surface water that's polluted. The groundwater in the lower Coachella Valley is saturated with nitrates and phosphates, some pesticides. So and some of that groundwater was intended to be used for drinking water, but now it can't be. So I really wish you would, somehow, and I will follow up, pay attention to these issues in our part of the state because they are really, really serious. Thank you for your help.
Thank you for your comments.
And Mark, just one thing, if there's a LIRIS list for the different work groups and for the council as well, so if you see any groups or work groups of the council that seem relevant that you might be interested in taking part in, including the Healthy Watersheds, as Karen mentioned, feel free to sign up for those work group emails, and then when those groups do convene, you can take part in those discussions.
Yeah, we do have a grassroots group of individuals, about 100 people, that are now kind of fed up with the progress on the Salton Sea Management Program and other Salton Sea issues. So either I or one of our grassroots folks will probably be getting engaged with your program.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So continuing on with agenda item 3, we have added an item to query the monitoring council members on activities you've done since the last council meeting related to council activities. The idea here being that we're talking about member expectations and developing those in a more formal document, and you'll hear about that when I go over the strategy subcommittee meeting notes. But thought we would start adding this as an item to just go around and hear of any things that have come up in your activities with your constituents that you represent that might be relevant for the rest of the council to hear. So with that, I'll just open it up. Does anyone have any items they want to bring up that aren't necessarily, I know we've had some committee meetings and we have time on the agenda to talk about those, but looks like Shelley's getting ready to make some comments. So go ahead, Shelley.
Thank you, Karen. Since our last meeting on May 30th, there are regularly scheduled calls and meetings of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. And so I gave them an update on the May 30th items during a call, and then followed up in their July meeting in person with a discussion of the 5 areas document. And then CASA wrote a letter that we'll be, I think, discussing later on today. Also, in our biennial report, which for my agency that just came out last week, we cited the Safe to Swim portal in one of the chapters. I think it's something that we often do, but it's just it's hyperlinked, so it's just a nice tie-in.
Other council members? Ray?
Yeah, so we had a California Coastkeeper Alliance science team call, so I just, I made a point on that to make, to bring up the My Water Quality portal and kind of remind everybody of its existence and to, have them start promoting that. Another thing I've been doing for the past 6 months is all of my interns, I've been having them just go to the portal without any input or anything and just have them tell me what they think. Just look at this, what does this mean to you? What do you see? So I've got about 20 different, I told them to write a paragraph on that. So I got a lot of input just from general new members of the public if somebody was just looking at this on just what they thought.
Are you planning to summarize that and provide it to the council?
I can just say part of the, I was telling Ken on the way in. First of all, they're amazed at all the tools and the information that's available. So that's a good thing. It's like, wow, there's really a lot here. And then the second thing is there's like, well, a lot of this data is really old, but there's the impression that we know everything and that we have an unlimited amount of data, and so it was an eye opener for them both ways on the types of tools, the amount of work that's gone into this type of stuff, but then also that some of the data is 10 years old. And I had somebody the other day say, well, why don't we have something from this year? And I said, well, it costs money.
Great.
And I do a lot of things that relate to monitoring, but the one that jumps out to share with you guys is I'm part of a steering group on the Safe Drinking Water Challenge this year, and it's led largely by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, as well as state agencies involved in efforts, the Department of Water Resources, Water Board, GovOps, people like that. Key events coming up, there's a really exciting 2-day hackathon in UC Berkeley, September 14th and 15th. 150 people signed up to do that. Nobel laureate is coming to speak at it. And then the other event is the award ceremony, October 18th in LA. That one is going to be, it'll be really exciting. There's lots of energy behind it. The site is waterchallenge.data.ca.gov.
Anyone else? Beth?
Well, you'll hear about my official subcommittee work after lunch today, but I have a slightly different announcement. I'm going to have to step down from the council after the end of this year just due to other time constraints, and I've really enjoyed my time here, and it's been great working with everybody. I'd also like to nominate Helen. I don't know if I can or not, but I would like to nominate my alternate as a member. Helen's been super engaged in the subcommittee work and has a lot of energy and enthusiasm for the monitoring council, and I think she'd be an awesome replacement. So I can stay on until the end of the year. I know we're a little down in numbers, so and I know it takes a long time to get somebody approved, but Helen's already partially been through the process, so maybe it won't go so rough. But anyway, thanks.
Well, thank you for your time and energy and volunteer effort to stay on the council and provide your good input. It's been a pleasure to have you.
I'll second that.
Any other council members? I have one item I wanted to bring up. Yesterday at our State Water Board meeting, the Heal the Bay came to present on a project that they've been working on that's been funded, at least in part, by the State Water Board and the Clean Beaches Initiative called Nowcast, and some of the modeling that they're doing to forecast beach water quality to be more real-time in letting the public know when a beach may be posted or needs to be posted. The board members were very engaged. I know there's some discussion of getting that information up on our Safe to Swim portal. I know Nick has been engaged with that group. Nick, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. I just thought it would be of interest to hear.
Yeah, I'm definitely working with Karen Black and Catherine Fake of the Division of Water Quality on updating the Safe to Swim portals and some of the linkages to our other resources, including the Heal the Bay report card, which includes at some of the beaches the Nowcast predictive modeling. It's just about providing the right descriptions and the right updates. I've provided feedback on how those should occur, and we should have those updated by the end of the week.
I'll just add that I want to recognize both Karen and Nick's leadership on trying to solve data flow. A big deal. So predictive analytics is really cool, but it's also important just to get the data that we're collecting.
Any other council activities folks want to mention?
I'm not a member, but I'll highlight the work done by the California Harmful Algal Blooms Network, or the CCHAB, in the recent Labor Day weekend incident reporting. We highlighted several water bodies that should be cautioned when recreating in, including Lake Elsinore, and trying to make it daylight those areas where it might be unsafe to recreate in the water body, and making sure they're posted correctly. And partly related to that, I was up in Truckee this last weekend, and I was flipping through a local publication and came across CCHAB Harmful Algal Blooms blurb in the publication that had different pictures of types of blooms and algae, and including harmful algal blooms, that had a paragraph describing our network, and it referenced our website and how to file incident reports and how that can lead to postings. And I think that's one of our more powerful work groups, and an example of where we can take advantage of emerging concerns and provide potential thresholds for recommending posting for the safety of the public. So that's being really well implemented.
All right. Anything else for the good of the council? Thank you for your updates, and you can expect this to be a continuing item on our agenda moving forward. So get out there and do work in between meetings was the idea behind this. So the last item we have in announcements and updates is Nick participates as a member of the National Monitoring Council. And so we thought we would have Nick provide us an update on those activities. Yeah,
this is another, hopefully, a running update that'll be reoccurring. We had a great presentation from Susan Holdworth, who is the co-chair for the National Council representing the EPA. Gary Rowe from the USGS is the other co-chair. But there was a recognition or reminder of the overlap between the states and the national councils, and we share a lot of the same concerns and problems and issues and how we should be leveraging each other's efforts. As far as an update for this go-around, the biggest one is the national conference meeting for the council, which is occurring March 25th to the 29th in Denver, Colorado. There's currently a call for abstracts, which is due September 15th, and I've been publicizing that to our work group co-chairs to try to get them, to encourage them to submit abstracts and participate. I know that they've attempted that in the past, even though that out-of-state travel can be difficult this late in the game, but been trying that just the same. And I encourage you all to look at your sectors and stakeholders and reach out to them to participate where applicable. There's also some newsletters that I'm going to start kind of referencing on the website that they come out with biannual newsletters where they show their updates and highlight how their work groups are moving forward. I'm just getting into the National Council and participating in many of the work groups and seeing exactly where the overlap is most beneficial to the council in California, as well as how I can help. I'll be attending a face-to-face with the council, which will be my first such meeting in Idaho in the beginning of November, so I'll report back again at the end of November on how that went and where we're going and kind of more thorough update. But right now it's basically the council, the conference, which is the first one in several years, and it's happening in Colorado and should be an exciting and event. And from hearing from Susan, it's one of the more valuable products the National Council produces as far as outreach to regional monitoring efforts, as well as getting state input. Is a 35-member council, which includes state representation as well as federal representation and community representatives. So it's an interesting council, and I hope that we can start collaborating more often. Questions?
All right, thanks, Nick. So with that, we'll move on to item number 4, and I think I'll just say that this item has got a lot of time allotted to it, and it may not take as much time. I'm going to give you an overview of the strategy subcommittee that met since our last meeting, actually met last week. And then we'll have updates also from the other subcommittees that have been formed, the coordination with the non-agency monitoring group, the communication subcommittee, and the monitoring council work group coordination. So we'll go over all of those subcommittee meetings that have occurred and what they're up to give the council an update. And so starting with the strategy subcommittee, we met last week. What day did we meet? On the 27th, I do believe. That subcommittee was formed after the council had basically voted to support the top 5 focus areas that that subcommittee had come up with as council direction moving forward. So with an eye toward modifying our council strategy, both to align, again, still with our authorizing legislation, SB 1070 of 2006, I believe, our original charge, the expertise that the council brings to the monitoring community, and the gaps in the data lifecycle that exist in the implementation of AB 1755 and how we can fill those gaps with the expertise and the charge that we have as a council. So just as a quick reminder for those of you who don't sleep on this every night, the 5 areas that we chose to focus on and the council has approved in support of are that the council is a vehicle for determining whether water quality monitoring programs are designed and implemented in a way that is both efficient and cost effective. The council establishes guidance on data quality and method consistency for established monitoring programs across the state. My shorthand for that is we support the production of comparable data that we can use to assess for larger questions across the state. The council can identify where data interpretation thresholds are needed and recommend what those thresholds should be, and identify emerging methods and technologies. We already heard about that already this morning from Susie Thoreau, and offer guidance on how those should be developed so that we can not only produce comparable data moving forward, but also be more efficient in the development of those methods so folks all kind of buy in and don't go down different paths of method development that ultimately result in data that you can't compare or use together. And finally, to link disparate monitoring programs from local and regional entities that conduct the majority of the monitoring across the state. So we're a connector vehicle. So those are the 5 areas, and it's important for you to know what those are because I'm going to talk a little bit about the rest of our agenda. So our strategy subcommittee met last week. I already mentioned that, and we specifically discussed a few things. One is addressing the implications of implementing this new framework established by the top 5, and what those implications are for the working groups that exist and what kinds of guidance might come out of that for the working groups charge and their work. We also talked about generally membership of the council. Beth had mentioned earlier in her announcement that she'll be leaving the council that we also have a number of vacancies, which is true, and we need to figure out how to address those vacancies, but at the same time establish clear expectations for council membership moving forward so we can be a more effective body to achieve these 5 goals or objectives or strategies, however we want to talk about them. And then the third piece is that we talked about the impacts of our 5 to the work group's charge and how to effectively communicate that to the work group. So we had a bit of an expanded subcommittee meeting. It included our original subcommittee, which was Taryn, myself, and Steve Weisberg, along with our staffs, Chris and Nick. We expanded it to include a couple of work group members, one of which was the lead of the wetlands monitoring work group, Josh Collins. And the second person was really charged with facilitating the meeting. Allie Dunn, who is in Greg's shop, came and but also provided some input from the work group perspective. She's also on the CC Hub network work group, so that was valuable. She also kept us on track, so that was great. And then Greg also joined us for the subcommittee meeting. So that's who convened. We talked about first, well, let me step back. We did have Susan Holdsworth, Nick mentioned. We had a presentation from Susan. I would argue it'd be a valuable presentation for her to bring to the full council. It was very valuable to hear from the national perspective what their big successes have been, and to know that we're not alone in the challenges we face as a council in terms of funding, in terms of participation, in terms of sort of finding ourselves after about 10 years of implementation. So that was nice. We're accomplishing a lot, but we have challenges just like all the other states do. I do want to mention a few things that Susan talked about, and the big ones being what their big successes are, and I think something for us to think about and talk through. One is the national conference is the biggest success she pointed to, and we've talked a lot about having our own conference here in California. I think it would be a valuable venue for practitioners and users of data, practitioners of monitoring and users of data to come together in a conference, and so I think we should be thinking about that, and I think that item will come up in our communications. I don't remember who's going to give the update. I guess Nick will. The data portal that EPA and USGS collaborated to provide their data out as a national portal was the second success she mentioned. Metadata standards discussions and the venues that they have to have those standardizing discussions is one that she pointed to. And then in the same vein, their upcoming approaches to sensor data and standards for sensor data were the big successes. So that was a valuable sort of set the stage discussion for our strategy committee to talk through some of the issues we're struggling with. Susan actually stayed on and listened, and so it was nice. She kind of plugged in with a few comments as we were talking about our issues as well. So we first talked about membership and the fact that we have some vacancies, and we're kind of in this strange time frame now with needing to get our council membership back up to full membership, but also who should our members be based on the audience and based on the focus areas that we have identified in the top 5. And so not only are we sort of finding ourselves, but then we're also in the middle of knowing that a new administration is coming on board, and we're going to have new agency secretaries. Probably won't get their attention for at least a year from now, maybe more, depending on our ability to get their attention. And so it's a bit of a strategy to figure out when do we bring some proposals to the agency secretaries, you know, the existing ones, or wait for the new ones to come on board. I think generally we came to the conclusion that it would be best to try to get the attention of the existing ones, only because we've actually gotten their attention recently with the flows work group, and at least the undersecretaries have been very engaged with that. And I've had some subsequent discussions with our executive management here at State Board, and they agree that getting the attention of the current agency secretaries is probably a good idea, which means that the membership discussion is one that we need to have probably sooner rather than later. So one of the products that we agreed to develop as part of our subcommittee was expectations for membership and some suggestions on. We've got general categories. We really aren't changing the general categories of membership that are already on the council, but trying to think of the different agency folks and monitoring practitioners that ought to be on the council. So we've initiated that discussion. Before I move on to the next piece, do any of the subcommittee members want to add to the membership item? I covered it. I'm spectacular today. I'm firing on all cylinders. All right. So let's see. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything in my notes. We do want the other piece of that that is not just related to membership, but I think membership will be the initial topic, is that we want to be able to have an audience with the agency secretaries, at least annually, be able to have a briefing for them. One of the things that Susan brought up was the accountability of the National Council is to the Advisory Committee on Water Information, that is a Department of Interior advisory committee. And having that accountability and that audience, the need to report back on successes and challenges, and asking for support, as an opportunity for asking for support, I should say, is one that she pointed to. And so, you know, we've not been all that good at getting the attention of our agency secretaries on a regular basis. And so I think, you know, that's our charge as co-chairs, but also I think it's a matter of who do we have on the council and how influential they are, and getting the attention of our administration representatives. Bruce, you look like you have a question.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the agency secretaries. You know, appreciate the opportunity for one area of agriculture to be represented as a regulated entity here. But it does need, it triggered in my mind thoughts I've had for a while. It really, for agriculture to be represented, really needs a broader group. And there's not one group other than, in my mind, CDFA that does that. And they have the technical resources. We're talking about a lot of very technical things. They have the bandwidth to then reach through all the 9 regions of this state and pull those comments back together. So, you know, I hope that as the council goes forward, or as it looks at its strategic vision, that CDFA can be part of it, because I think that's key. As folks were giving their reports, I was thinking about capacity, and while I don't need a lot of sleep and I try to have as much enthusiasm as possible, a lot of folks know that in Region 5 right now, we are absorbed with updates to waste discharge requirements and the CV salts process, and so the bandwidth and the attention span for agriculture in the largest region of the state is pretty limited. I could throw money around, maybe, I don't know, but, you know, grant money around to induce them, but there's a lot. And so I think CDFA, DPR perhaps, you know, are logical partners in not only crafting strategic visions, but then reaching back to the regulated community, whether they be stormwater, whether they be POTWs, and you know, for CDFA, agriculture, and soliciting that input.
Oh, Shelley, did you have some?
Just related to who the members should be within those same categories, I think we're looking for people that have contact statewide with their stakeholders, and that they have a broad understanding of monitoring. Are the monitoring council, and if, whether it's regional monitoring or local monitoring, that they have that understanding. Some degree of technical knowledge of that, I think, is a bonus.
Okay. I'm going to skip the second topic because we did talk about, oh, go ahead.
Just wanted to add, as part of that discussion with the agency secretaries, that that would be open to all the members of the council. So that would be as part of incentive for being a council member, an active council member, that you have that time to engage with agency secretaries. It wouldn't just be the co-chairs and or the staff. It would be open to all the council members to get that time.
Okay, so the second topic we talked about was the letter that we received from CASA, but I'm going to skip that to the end and just talk a little bit more about what we talked about with regard to the direction to the working groups. And I think we agreed that the working groups did a good job of coming together to pull data together, and some even went beyond, which I think was the intent, was to not only pull data together and present it in a portal, but also look at the data gaps and the gaps in data comparability that make it difficult to combine data sets. Some did that better than others. Some are meeting more regularly than others. We had Allie and Josh on the strategy committee last week to kind of give us their input. Some of the stuff we heard were that the work groups need to see themselves as a collective group under the council, that they can learn from each other and interact with each other more frequently. I think that there has been some effort to do that, but I think we heard that there needs to be more of that, that there needs to be clear and consistent communications with the work groups. Maybe we didn't communicate as clearly what the work group's charge was at the outset and ultimately hold them accountable for it. Need to get the work group chairs more involved with the council, which I think is good advice. Let's see. So one of the things that came from the discussion was that the subcommittee in coordination with Greg and OEMA staff will refine the performance measures for the work groups based on the 5 focus areas of the council. An assessment tool will accompany the performance measures and allow for an objective audit of the current work groups in the portals. And, are some work groups even needed anymore? Do they need to morph into something different or disband at this point? So I think we need to be kind of open to all ideas in that regard. And then there are new work groups that we're forming as we speak, as needed. So it kind of gets to Greg's point of, do we have work groups that are standing work groups that are needed over a long term, or there are sort of more project level type teams or whatever we want to call them that have a specific charge and then they disband once that project is completed or achieved. Let's see, I think that's, and then we just suggested that the results of the self-assessment and objective audits will be summarized and provided at future council meetings. Was there anything, please, add?
I was going to go a little deeper into the data topic that we talked about. We challenged ourselves to think about how does this council relate to the AB 1755 governance structures that are being put into place, process and work products. And so one of the areas that we talked about was so for example, there's Open and Transparent Water Data Act groups that are talking about metadata standards. California network that we're publishing water data on, using and testing out this interoperability. And the question was, will they be doing the work that the council needs to be doing to talk about data accessibility? My answer to that is, at this point, no, probably never either, because what they're working on is sort of an infrastructure and working, but they're not focusing on which data is more important than other data necessarily. And if they were, they're not necessarily talking about some of the monitoring, water quality monitoring topics that we test bed, just water budgeting around California, but it would be water use and allocation, not so much the I just wanted to sort of illustrate that in case people are wondering, are we doing something that another group is going to be doing? And I think right work to do on just the water quality data. And I think we did sort of go down the road of talking about the data life cycle for some of the existing. Safe to Swim is an easy one to talk about since we already did. And so some sort of mapping and understanding of where data goes and where it gets stuck and what's an opportunity for us to intervene as a group, both state agencies and stakeholders, to prove whether or not that data shows up so that the public can see if it actually is. So just a little shining a light on some of that conversation for the group.
Sure, I think that part of the work group charge was that we realized that during the portal development that I was supposed to identify those gaps and identify those areas where we are maybe not getting the complete picture, rather than just having a portal for a portal's sake. And that's hopefully going to be an output of this kind of independent audit. Also, we committed to myself and Chris to reach out to the work groups individually and kind of better explain what the top 5 document is intending. I think we'll get to this a little bit more in the next piece of this discussion, but that top 5 was just kind of 5 general broad categories where we think we add value and can do better. But I think it also misses a key part where we kind of talked about it with AB 1755 and tried to capture with that kind of where does it link up. But part of the thing I think where the council can really excel and continue to excel is turning data into information and to inform decision makers and decisions and recommendations to the secretaries, which can be taken wherever they see fit. And that's really the niche that the council can really build on and get the work groups excited, because I think that's a key part that gets staff and the work groups excited about, is turning data into actual actionable and information. So that's just one key piece that's kind of left out of the top 5 or kind of lost a little bit, that I think that needs to be kind of updated when we go back to to better finalize that document and what it's intended to do. It's really just a basic framework for a larger, more comprehensive strategy update. It's not all-inclusive. So.
Okay, so then the last item we talked about was the letter that we received from CASA, and I guess I'll start with, why don't you all summarize your concerns, and then we can talk through what, how we responded to them.
Thanks, Karen. I wanted to point out that we have Adam and Jared here also from CASA, so they can chime in. So I also want to back up right before we talk about the letter and mention when we're talking about membership, I wasn't sure where it would fit in the agenda, and I kind of brought it up in May 30th before our meeting, and we've had a few communications with Nick and Chris about it, and also an email from Adam expressing that CASA would like me to be their member rather than an alternate and have Phil step down. So I just want to kind of put that out there. I'm not sure where in item 4 it fits in, but if that can be discussed today.
Question. Memo passed around. I don't remember seeing it.
It was linked. They linked it to the May 30th meeting. So if you go to the May 30th meeting, you'll find this letter from CASA. It was, okay.
Separate from the agenda.
Pass it around if you want. Yeah. So back to the letter. This came about after a couple of discussions with the CASA membership, which is how we do everything we discuss as a group. And the group had a lot of concerns about the 5 items, specifically items 2, 3, and 4. So they wrote a letter kind of highlighting those concerns. Should I go kind of point by point, or?
Yeah, and I think maybe it might help to summarize at a high level, and then we can go point by point if you want to, Shelley. But I think the main concern that was in there, and we discussed it, it was brought to our attention, we discussed it among our regulatory work group in July, which resulted in sending the letter. And I think at a very high level, it just seemed to represent a fundamental shift in the nature of what the council was doing. So again, not having a lot of direct interaction with the council, my impression has always been it was data gathering, coordination among the agencies, dissemination of data and information through the portals, all that type of thing. And a lot of the language that was used in the 5 strategies document struck people as more, we're going to be developing things, recommendations, we're going to be developing thresholds, we're going to be developing all these things that seem to be a departure from what the council did before. And so that sort of just got people's attention and at a high level. And the other part was, and again, not having a lot of direct interaction with the council, I can't speak exactly to it, but I think formally, or right now, the way that the council works is more of a bottom-up structure within its work group. So a lot of the work's done there, and it comes up to the council itself. And the way that the 5 strategies document was written was more top-down. So it was more the council is doing all these things, and it would funnel down to the work groups. And so those are kind of the 2 big ones, and that's the theme of what we kind of put in our comments and really want to discuss with you, because I know, it says one thing on paper, but it's helpful to hear it from you all and what you meant by the strategy document and sort of how you see it playing out in the future. And that's kind of what we wanted to do with the letter, is start that conversation. So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Shelley. I just wanted to give a high level of what we discussed. No, I think that was perfect. I think that kind of summed it up nicely. And so maybe we can discuss around that.
Sure. So we talked about a response, and actually I'm going to point to Nick. Nick prepared the response, and so I'm going to let Nick kind of go over at a high level what the intent of our 5 focus areas were, and it was, I'll just say in general, not intended to take over or be more regulatory in nature or directive in nature, but to to key into the specific expertise that we as a council bring to the state as value, and to provide more guidance to the working groups as to the charge that they have in their work. So Nick, do you want to?
Sure. I think I was trying to start that conversation. That the top 5 document is really just a straw man framework for helping to refocus the Monitoring Council strategy as a whole and helping it to realign it with the intent of SB 1070, which is again to look at the statewide monitoring programs and look to creating efficiencies and comparability, as well as providing data accessibility. I think of those, the focus has been primarily on the data accessibility pieces of it through the portals, and there's been kind of a loss on the comparability and efficiencies and emerging issues pieces. So the intent of the top 5 was actually the top 5 itself, when I wrote that document, was a summarization of what the strategy work group was kind of talking about as areas where A, we add value, and B, where we could do better in certain areas that would increase our value. And hopefully we could build off that. Like, for example, top 5 explains that we will reach out to disparate monitoring programs, and really that is just a key into the need for a more comprehensive communication strategy, which would include outreach to different programs. But it's not explicitly stated, and I don't think that the top 5 document is intended to be explicit, and it's not the actual comprehensive update. It's just kind of 5 ideas that the council in general agreed upon on the May 30th meeting as areas where we do that value and could do better. Related to the specific comments about changing the structure, that's definitely not the intent of the document, as we were again just identifying the efforts to providing better guidance to the work groups. The work groups may have stated that they've had little interaction with the council, and this could be an opportunity to refocus their efforts to make sure that they're working on the products that we'd like them to be working on, including identifying those efficiencies and those data gaps, and where we can hopefully break down those roadblocks, as well as develop guidelines for giving, for providing that, how to identify efficiencies, how to identify data gaps, and being a venue for that interaction. And where we need to, we can make recommendations to the agency secretaries for helping to break down those roadblocks, or to get access or participation from other agencies that we're not getting them from now. And then again, about thresholds, that's really kind of an example of where we add value via the CC Hab network, where we have an issue with harmful algal blooms, and several state agencies measuring harmful algal blooms, but no real thresholds that are defined to help identify, is this safe for your dog to swim in, is it safe for you to swim in. So the work group got together, and as a collective group identified and came to consensus on thresholds and ways to notice that to the states. That was an identification of where we provided significant value to the state, and where we could build off that effort, and that really links with the molecular methods and ways that we can see these emergency issues and take advantage of those. And that's just more of an identification of, look, this is a success, we should be focusing on areas like this and moving forward. That really was the intent of that section of Area 3. Building upon that was, what Susie kind of mentioned about technology is improving all the time, and with that is going to come new methods that are being used, new programs that are going to be developed. The council bringing in older monitoring programs was bound between agencies already being wed to their methods and having to figure out the comparability pieces. We see this as an opportunity with these new methods and new technologies to get ahead of the ball, to start thinking about comparability and making data more easily turned into information by coordinating early through things like the molecular methods, environmental flows, to make sure that when these programs do start being developed and are being implemented in the regulatory frameworks, that they're being done in a thoughtful way, before, they're almost set in stone. So that's really what the intent of that area is for. But, just to reiterate, it's really just a starting point for a larger discussion. We see that this strategy will be updated over time, and in an open, transparent way. I want to say that I appreciate the comments, and it provided an opportunity to provide a little bit more clarity to the document and kind of what its intent was. But as a whole, it's just a building point.
Yeah, and to add to that, I'll just say that, these are, our top 5 document is 4 pages max?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very brief. Doesn't really get into the details of, how we would implement, what our intent was, and that would be something we would flesh out in a more full strategy document. And so, we're still at the early stages, and of course, all of those discussions would happen in our open meetings and in a transparent way. So with that, did you have additional?
No, I just want to say thank you for the sort of detailed response. I mean, it was a 4-page response to a 4-page document, so I didn't mean to impose a lot more work on you, but we really appreciate that, and it did provide some clarity and context where we're going. I mean, we'd be very interested, obviously, in continuing to participate in the development of that. We have some sort of narrow specific concerns, I think, still mostly related to the threshold setting discussion and issue and what that would mean. But aside from that, we just, we appreciate the response and want to continue to participate in development of whatever comes after this.
I actually really appreciate this conversation happening. I think in this day and age, it's really important to have venues that can discuss these kinds of things that are not sort of the deciding bodies. And so I would really encourage us to sort of continue teasing out the areas that are the right place to have these conversations and the right ways to have them. And I just know with harmful algal blooms in particular, and Nick gave a really good summary. I will point out that a lot of that work was done prior to them becoming a work group, but it was because of that recognition of their effort of sort of refereeing a conversation about what is the appropriate levels for different kinds of protection, levels for different toxins for different end uses, so dogs and kids and what have you, drinking. So really, really helpful. The next step is going to be a heavy lift by anyone, whether it's values as regulatory criteria, but just that work of sort of feeling that out and informing the public is valuable in my opinion. So I really applaud having this conversation, but I really hope that, and I'll just add that when I came on board to OEMA 3.5 years ago, this question of where the council is headed, and I was sitting in Karen's chair at the time, where the council is headed and what do they want to work on has been sort of being batted around for a few years. And I've seen a lot of good, bold leadership on this to sort of make us move where we want to go. So I would also encourage us to keep trying to do that.
Just one comment, not to beat the horse dead, but I think when we talk about thresholds in this group, it's not really about regulatory thresholds, it's about communication thresholds. And the example that comes to my mind is early on, we had an issue with how to interpret fish tissue data on the portal. And we had OEHA interpreting it one way, we had the 303D list interpreting it another way. And so when we put this information on the portal, it led to confusion in the public as, can I eat the fish here, or, am I going to die? Right? That was and so we worked really hard to try to come to some common threshold, and in the end we failed. And so what we ended up doing in the portal was just describing why these thresholds were different and what they mean to provide information to the public so that they wouldn't think they would die.
And I thank you, because I appreciate that distinction. I think obviously where we would have more concern is sort of what you mentioned, is translating what is a threshold here in terms of public knowledge into something that would end up as a water quality standard or water quality objective, which has its own process that we're sort of comfortable with, and sort of where is the line between saying that the Water Quality Monitoring Council has developed this and this is what is appropriate, and then taking that as fully vetted somewhere else, or it's just information designed for this purpose. And if we're going to do something more regulatory in nature, it has to be done sort of separately through this process. So that, obviously, that's the tension that we're most concerned about going forward.
Right, and I think that I tried to emphasize it in the response letter that the council itself can't set standards, but we can certainly make recommendations to the secretaries, and that's what we should be ultimately doing, and saying, look, this is a need. Here's some. Our work groups have done this to help with the, with the harmful algal blooms, or even Safety e-portal, where there's some confusion or where there's a need for the wildlife or public health safety to set, or promulgate standards. That's up to them and the appropriate agency to do that through their own public process, consistent with state and federal laws. So hopefully that comes out clear.
And to the extent that, obviously you haven't developed a full strategy document, but that becomes a more core function of what you do, I'd really appreciate if we looked at how much time to review documents and things of that nature, because we vet everything, at least through CASA on the POTW end, to our regulatory work group. We meet once a month. We would love to have at least a month to look at that so it can be on the meetings and sort of have a discussion and then be able to come back. I'm not authorized, or Shelley's not authorized to make a decision on things like that. It really is vetted through our whole community, and I would assume a lot of the regulated stakeholders sort of operate the same way in the association world. So the more time we had to look at documents ahead, I think the better response we'll be able to provide for the future.
Just add, thank you, very much. I think that's a great point, particularly as this has been, I think, an excellent exercise. I think, one, I want to thank Shelley for reporting out on the council's work to the community, to CASA, so that then this creates that dialogue. I'm also curious if there are any other members of the council who have additional questions or thoughts related to this exchange, and also how we went about things May 30th, kind of versus where we're going, if there are any other questions. But I do think we, as a council, recognizing the multiple viewpoints that are represented here, that we recognize, and I guess I'd look at council members to help us determine what are the time frames for important decisions like that. So when we are kind of looking at our strategy and our timeline, that any kind of feedback that way would help us, Chris and Nick, for that. So I'm hoping that we can get, that from all. So that's very helpful as a point. Shelley, anything to say?
Oh, just on the timeline, I think going from, since the council meets quarterly, going from one meeting to the next would probably be an appropriate timeline that would give groups enough time to have their meetings and have, a decent comment period within their group, and assimilating that and bringing that information back to the council. But it does take, at least that much time. It can't be something that can be done within a couple weeks after a council meeting.
Greg, did you have another comment?
Yeah, I just want to point out the nexus of this conversation to the topics here, then I think we'll a lot of gaps that have to be filled in, like the
Okay, anything else on that topic? Any questions about our strategy work group and where we're going?
Is that an open meeting, the work group, the strategy work group meeting?
Well, so we're trying to avoid having too many council members where we have to announce it. Is the word notice? Yeah, to have a quorum, which we came close to having a quorum the other day, so that was a concern. So I guess a subcommittee is charged with bringing back what we do back to this group. So I guess yes and no to some degree.
And are they recorded as well?
We didn't. Yeah. No.
But just to be clear, are you asking, is the membership of the subcommittee open? Asking, is it open in the sense that any member of the public can participate in it?
I understand there's the quorum constraint, so it would be any member of the public.
Yeah, we didn't notice it as a public meeting.
Just keep going.
All right, then we'll keep going. We'll move on to the next subcommittee update, since we have some time before we're to break for lunch, on coordination with non-agency monitoring groups. And Helen, you're going to give us an update on that subcommittee.
This is a discussion that came out of figuring out how to engage smaller non-agency groups in what Council is doing. And so a few months ago, Terry and Beth and I had a telephone call trying to figure out what the Council might be able to provide benefit-wise to these smaller non-agency groups. And we came up with a few things that I think are a start. QA/QC, monitoring methods, trying to teaching people how to collect good data that could get into CEDN, possibly help with equipment, things like that. And I think that was a good start, but we don't actually know what groups need. I'm sure we missed some things. And so we decided to start a survey that we would get out to these kinds of groups. And I've been working with Beth and Terry and also with Eric Burris, who has done a similar sort of survey in the past and has been very helpful in this. And I think this is an attachment on the agenda. I took this to the data management working group a month or two ago for some really great feedback they had, both people in the room and people who called in. It's getting rather large, and Eric's last comment was that we really don't want to give people something that's going to take more than 5 minutes to fill out and involves some real thought or research. So I would love to get feedback on this, as well as maybe hear if Terry and Beth have anything to add with that in mind.
No, I think you did a great job. I mean, basically, we're trying to engage more people in the Monitoring Council, and this is one of the avenues that we have a lot of.
Right, so this was, this outgrowth was from Area 5, from the top 5 document. Okay, how do we do that? And the idea was like, okay, how do we inventory the groups that are out there? And then after that, where do they see? Are they aware of us? Are they aware of the tools that we can provide? The clean water team under SWAMP, what they provide to better characterize how we can engage them. That makes it, what's in it for them type of question. So that's what I think the overall goal of the survey is to do, is to help inventory them, and then also to help identify the best method for communicating with them in a way that provides value to them and get them to participate with us and provide their data and take advantage of the tools that we have available to them.
And just one thing to quickly add is that, as you're looking through the survey, maybe be mindful of whether or not it represents adequately the constituents that you represent. And is there any other things that we might want to consider to include in the survey to maybe address the different groups that you represent? So maybe as you're looking through that, keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, when we had our first conversation, Terry and Helen and I, we recognized a difference between large monitoring groups and more smaller grassroots. And Helen and I really come from the perspective of the smaller grassroots. So the survey and our discussion ended up kind of focusing in that direction, but we don't mean it to be sort of exclusive to that. But on the other hand, we don't want a survey that takes more than 5 minutes to fill out. So, we're always trying to walk that balance of trying to get the key information that we need as the council to understand how we can engage better without, turning people off when they get to page 20 of the survey.
And just one more comment. As you think about what's going into this survey, we should also think about when we get a bunch of responses, what are we going to do about it? Yes, there was. So Nick and Eric have been involved in this process. We talked about, how we can use the clean water group to help with some of those things. We've talked about education, those types of things. Nick, you want to add? Because I forget.
Sure. I mean, I think that we'll have to digest the data and turn it into information for us to use. How many responses did we get? How many were aware of us? How many are submitting data to the systems that we have access to? And if not, can we help them get data into it? And if so, in what method? So I think once we release the survey, if it can be finalized, then we can take a look at the data and come up with a summary of what the findings are and maybe potential paths forward, whether that's through an annual conference where we provide the training that maybe comes out of this. Maybe the groups are saying, well, I've never done QA/QC or never developed a QAPP. It's like, okay, well, we can utilize the training tools that we have available already to maybe do a session at a conference. Or part of the questions here, are there already conferences that these people attend on a regular basis that we could insert ourselves into and attend, and then provide that kind of information rather than trying to develop an annual conference on our own without a funding mechanism. So I think we'll take the data as it comes in and then hopefully summarize it and provide some recommendations, and then the council itself can decide on how it wants to move forward.
Much of this data is already available. I think of anybody who's got a discharge permit. Most of those questions, I can tell you, yes, I can tell. So, looking at Greg, data master, because what will happen is you will send it out to folks who have a permit, and they'll go, okay, they'll set that aside. You'll get a small subset. So I'm trying to think how you might be able to front load this to accomplish exactly what you want to do, is focus what the need truly is and achieve that. So that you save some time for people who have permits, or there's a set of questions on there that aren't readily answerable from the data that's already sitting in seasoned in other files.
So we are actually trying to pull together a story about monitoring data in our realm, because we wanted to start our boards, and we sort of have a draft document. We're happy to share it. I don't know how helpful it would be to frame the survey. It's overwhelming to us. I mean, there's thousands of facilities that have. And then there's external parties that do data collection. Not put it into seed and then wish it was. Just those two streams alone, but then the easier stuff would be the self-directed stuff, as we're calling it, that describes the SWAMP program and the Gamma program. Happy to share that with you if you think it's informative. I think it might be a little overwhelming for people, but it also might help us grow our story so that we can tell a more effective story, getting feedback from people who would be interested in where does the data go, why is it collected, what's the quality assurance plan that's directing over that data, or governing that data. So all those questions I think we're trying to wrap our arms around, but it's overwhelming. Happy to share it with people too.
I would say that if back to Bruce's question, if there are permittees that are already submitting to a data system of some form that we have access to, then great. Assuming that they're following, QA/QC protocols and the system in place is actually being successfully implemented. But we're really trying to identify those groups that are outside of that regulatory realm, and ways to capture them and touch them in a thoughtful way. So while we could use that still as an inventory, say, okay, we have all these groups, and maybe provide what they're monitoring and where. The real intent, I think, is to reach out to those groups that we haven't reached out to yet, and ways to successfully do that.
I'm an alternate, and I haven't been in a while, is there actually a timing for the survey? Anything like that out of the subcommittee?
I was going to suggest maybe having a similar time frame for at least the review by the council members to provide feedback as the earlier item, September 19th, if we wanted to have that as a time frame for council members to provide any kind of input or suggestions to Helen, Beth, and Terry, and then that group could then figure out the next steps for the timing for the survey. I don't know, timing-wise, if you guys have any goals that you've discussed, but okay.
So just to pull us back to why we formed the subcommittee to begin with, it was acknowledged that there's a lot of monitoring that's going on that isn't part of our working groups, isn't part of the discussion here at the council level, and we've got this charge both under SB 1070 in our current strategy, and then moving forward with our top 5. One of the big top 5 is to better coordinate and connect people that are doing monitoring, whether they're doing it for regulatory purposes or for citizen science and building community and capacity at a local watershed level. And so in my mind, this survey and the work of the subcommittee helps us inform what we put into our strategy, you know, put the flesh on the bones of our strategy and update what kinds of activities the council should be doing to support those groups that are doing the monitoring. So I just wanted to make sure we kept that kind of big picture in mind. Yes, there's this survey. We want to make sure we're doing it for a purpose that we will then use, not just wasting people's time to respond to a survey.
The group that's been talking about the future of the council, whatever you want to call it, over the last few years, has often thrown out the idea on Steve's suggestion, I think, that one of the roles of this group would be to sort of keep an eye on all the monitoring happening, whether it's regional efforts. I would suggest that maybe this becomes an opportunity to at least consider that. I don't, you know, like, so as we're going down this road of do we form a citizen monitoring thing or whatever, just know that I think it's in our wheelhouse, so to speak, to talk about this and to actually learn lessons from this regional monitoring effort does things this way. If it's helpful, I would suggest or propose that a future item at the council be to discuss that larger realm, and I could have the staff that's working on the monitoring data.
One last quick comment. I think this serves kind of two purposes. One is sort of an information gathering, and the other one is sort of advertising, right? It's reaching out to folks who may not even have heard of us.
I want to go.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to go back to Ken. I think, what's a reasonable time frame? Because this is a draft. We've been working on it, I don't know, for three months or so. What's a reasonable time frame to get council feedback to the subcommittee before, to allow them to release it to the world and have you guys release it to your stakeholders as well?
So, one, vector control's not on there, so that probably falls under the other category of monitoring. And for, I don't know, for organizational, and you guys are smarter at this than I am, Greg, is there a point of contact at each of the regional boards that can provide this information in a pretty quick manner? I mean, these are all,
Personally, I think we should take off grower, farm bureau, people that have discharge permits. I think your point's well taken.
They're all covered under the Ag Water Quality
partly, I think they're covered under what Greg is gathering for information for our board about what monitoring do we ask for and what data do we get as a result of that. And so, yeah, I think we need to refine the organization with that in mind and not waste people's time responding to something they've already, Yeah, agreed.
Maybe you could have a preamble about who the intended audience is at the beginning of the survey so that it's very clear.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. And also, maybe Greg, if you can provide the group with the overview of who we're already kind of covering in the work that you're doing so that we don't duplicate. Is the end of September reasonable? Okay, end of September.
And I said that was the final comment on my part, but I lied.
You lied.
I'm getting back to Beth's point, is that this really targets the small guys, and there are a number of, large to medium-sized groups that we're not coordinating with, and so we need to find a way to work that. And so that's future work to come.
All right, so earlier I was going to make a comment on Terry's comment about communication, and I was going to say that that is a nice segue into the next subcommittee, but first let's have lunch. So we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock and regroup with the communication subcommittee.
I was just curious how the membership portion that we were going to talk about as part of item 4 was going to fit into this. Is that something that would happen after lunch? Adam, his best time is before lunch, if we want to include CASA in that discussion.
So we were planning as a subcommittee to come up with expectations for council members. We don't have a formal sort of nomination / document that we were going to vet today necessarily.
No, I think it's an opportunity to recognize, and maybe in a public forum, that CASA has recommended that Shelley be their full member and representative on the council, and to replace Phil. It's up to the co-chairs how you want to address that. We are looking more in depth on membership, including drafting expectations, which will include a level and a participation and what we're looking for in council membership, and whether that fits within the roles.
Well, and to be clear, it's the agency secretaries that appoint members, and so an endorsement of a statewide association like CASA is certainly something that gets included in the documentation for the secretaries to approve an appointment. So
yeah, that's a good point. So I think the process would be that we're going to draft up the expectations and provide that to the council for review and comment, and then that with the intent that would be part of the briefing for the secretaries that are currently in place, or they're undersecretaries, as part of our overall briefing with them as a piece of it to get their feedback as well.
Yeah, and feel free to have that discussion. The only thing that I would add is that Shelley does have our full support to become a full member, and if there's anything that we need to do to memorialize that support, or whatever the process is to be developed, just let us know and we can do that.
And just to confirm, until you finish the process of co-chairs and the subcommittee, I mean, Shelley's got full rights and responsibilities as a full member right now, as long as Phil's not here, right? So, yeah.
So anything else on that? All right, now we can have lunch. So 1 o'clock. We don't lock the doors for this room, I don't think. Oh, okay. so we're going to go ahead and get started. 4 minutes late. I'll note I was on time. Karen was on time, so the co-chair is golden. Staff were on time, so that's good. So we have a couple of more committee updates to go over before we move on to item number 5. So we left off at the communications work group, and Nick is going to give us an update on the progress of that, I guess, subcommittee work group. What are we calling them? Subcommittees?
That's a subcommittee, yeah.
Yeah.
So part of that subcommittee is it's myself and Chris, and then Shelley Walther and Ray Heimstra are also a part of this effort. And this again came kind of an outgrowth of strategy talks and the noticing that the need for a communications strategy or plan. And we've met a few times and tried to kind of put our collective minds together to put together as comprehensive a plan as possible. I distributed out a Google document link to this document here. And it's kind of our best attempt to incorporate all the major areas that we could, think of related to communication, whether that be internal communication, whether that be council member to council member to work groups to council, and then, how we interact with our stakeholders, how the council members interact with their sectors. And so we put together this document, and, what we recognize is that as council members across the various varying sectors that you guys might have access to media experts or communication experts that, we certainly are not. We're kind of doing our best to try to find resources online and existing documents and trying to shift them or cater them towards the council's view. We found some interesting pieces of information. Probably the best one, or the one I borrowed the most from, has been the communication and then also stakeholder outreach plan from the IEP or interagency program. The thought being there that that's a federal and state multi-agency group and has to deal with some of the similar roadblocks and challenges that we do. So we've taken some of that and melded that into this document. But if you guys have access to, as part of your roles, media experts or communication experts, and if you could share this document, it's an open Google document, and get their feedback of areas where we might be lacking or where we're missing the mark a little bit, that would be really helpful to us as a subcommittee, because again, we're not communications experts. Ray's probably got the most experience dealing with the communication, but even so, applying it to a multi-agency, multi-sector group has been a challenge. That being said, we're trying to incorporate a lot of what we talked about today. How do we communicate as a council? And we're already trying to implement little pieces where we think they're no-brainer kind of good ideas. Like council member updates, something where that's part of an encouragement to, as a council member, be communicating with your sectors on council activities, or if you're going to a conference that has some direct linkage to the council, you should be discussing them. Those are intertwined with the communication as well as, council member expectations. So there's a lot of kind of interplay between the overall strategy and how the communications document kind of interplays with that. We were trying to populate this table here and identifying, okay, who are the members, who you represent, how you communicate with that sector, because theoretically you're supposed to be representing that sector, and then how often do you communicate and how you communicate to really establish a baseline for how the information we talk about here gets out to the broader realm of people. That information came back rather sparsely, so if you do have a time to kind of go into this document and populate it, you can see some examples of the information Shelley provided, as well as Karen, that kind of allows us to kind of better, identify how we can plan a document review, for example, which you talked about earlier. If we realize that you guys are meeting quarterly, for example, then that'll take some more lead time for providing document and adding for adequate feedback from a certain sector. We've also touched on possible ideas like the annual conference idea. Is that a viable option? If so, how do we go about funding those? When we talk to the National Council, they actually have some funding available, and then they also rely on registration fees. You know, how is the mechanism to do that? Those are kind of larger discussions, but we're trying to incorporate that here. Another piece that we talked about earlier is how to interact with agency secretaries. That's captured in here. Is that it can be annual basis, and who takes place, and how that communication should occur. So again, this is a 13-page document. We're trying to be very comprehensive, trying to capture everything that we see as being needed, and then also developing metrics for, you know, measuring, are we doing what we say we should be doing. We identified that should really be the task of the communication group, to kind of be looking at this this plan and revisiting it on an annual basis. With the implementation pieces, we've tried to develop metrics, again, borrowed heavily from the IEP, and then providing a venue for reporting back on how we're doing as a communication overall, and then kind of coming back to the council with recommended changes or you know, patting ourselves on the back type of deal. But, you know, basically at this point, what we're really hoping for is to get your feedback and suggestions on areas where we're missing the mark, or where we should maybe bolster the metrics or the objectives. And then again, if you have access to communication and media type experts, then we would encourage you to share this with them, and for the same end, to get us feedback. We decided that a reasonable time frame for that kind of communication would be 45 days. So if we could get that feedback somewhere in the October 22nd is a date that I was going to throw out there as a feedback deadline to get from you all, so that we can incorporate those changes and bring them back to the council. But again, this is a living document as well. I guess that's important to point out, that it will be part of our larger strategy shift, but this document will be morphing over time, and we're not, if we have good ideas, like briefing the secretaries and adding updates, we're going to start trying to implement those in piece-by-piece basis as we see them as being helpful. Karen, you're on the subcommittee too. You're on the subcommittee too, right? I forgot to identify that. So Karen is also on that subcommittee. So if you guys have anything to add, that's kind of a rough overview of where we are.
Yeah, I do want to add, just sort of you kind of touched on this, but this came out of a recognition that not a ton of people outside of our own sort of insular community knows what the Monitoring Council is or what we're doing. It's crystal clear in how much effort we have to put into even getting the folks in the administration and the legislature to be including us in the AB 1755 documentation and strategies. So, you know, it's a matter of getting our word out and what do we bring to the table as added value to the state. It's also about membership, as Nick pointed out, and, you know, what are our key messages? I'll bet if we asked, and we said this before, but if we asked every council member what is the council and what are they supposed to do, we'd probably get different answers from every council member. So it's a matter of also tightening up what our messages are, what our key expertise is, you know, what is our elevator speech, and we should all have a pretty darn similar elevator speech about the council, right? So I think keeping that in mind, and then Nick already talked about all the ways that we need to communicate and who we need to communicate with, and how this needs to be a expectation for council members to be able to represent the council in other venues and intend to represent the council in other venues when the opportunity arises. So your feedback is definitely welcome, and this is just an initial draft, so you know, we've got lots more work to do. Go ahead.
I'll just to add to your point about messaging, and so that the council members are on the same page in terms of the council's goals and what we're working towards. But I think that also, kind of through these conversations, we also recognize that the work groups themselves and the work group chairs, it's good for the work groups to also have a clear sense of purpose, what our goals are relative to the councils. And so I think that was kind of a helpful discussion to make sure that those messages get out to the right folks, not just the council members, but the work groups. And kind of relating to Karen's last point, I think one of the things that was a really helpful exercise, which just to put on the council members' radar for the feedback that we'd like to get, is just thinking through the different groups that we should be targeting for outreach and messaging. And we've made a start in the document to try to identify, such as the agency secretaries, managers within our respective organizations, and staff level folks. If there are other people that we may want to consider, it was also a helpful exercise not just to identify those folks, but thinking about what is the key message that we want to get across, what form should that message take shape in, whether it be presentations or fact sheets or whatever. So it's been helpful to kind of think through all those types of things so that we have more of a clear sense of how we want to do the type of outreach that we'd like to do. So.
I would add that this document also provides a nice opportunity, given the change of direction of the council and possibly producing some more work products that will draw interest from stakeholders. It'll give a nice way to deal with that and to have a forum to engage stakeholders.
Sorry, Nick, I don't remember if at the title it emphasized draft or at the top. It just might be helpful, I think, knowing that it is, the link says draft, but maybe the document too. I know it has a date, but just because, knowing that with a lot of the shifting and kind of some, and all this input that we're trying to get, we don't want to give an impression that things are set. So I think it's helpful if we try to mark those so that we know, feedback is kind of in process. That would be helpful.
Any other questions or comments? We welcome your feedback. Please take a minute to, edit, add. I think it's a good start for sure. So October 22nd is your deadline.
That's correct. 22nd. It's a Monday.
All right. Well, unless there's any other comments on communications, we'll move to the last update from our committee, from Chris, on monitoring council work group coordination.
Thank you. So this subcommittee actually morphed over several monitoring council meetings. We initially had the subcommittee, its purpose was for the work groups to get together to discuss portal coordination, but through some of the more recent conversations that we've had with the monitoring council, we've recognized that just the work groups in general, having a venue to be able to have that coordination broader than just portal efforts was important. And so the work group morphed from being a subcommittee focused on portal efforts to the broader work group coordination. And so, that came about just within the past few months since our last meeting for the subcommittee. What we initially were charged to do was more portal focused, and so that's what our efforts have been so far. Really what we've met to accomplish is to try to address some of the outcomes of the Google Analytics that were presented back in November of last year, where we observed that the council's portals were not being really viewed as much as we would like. And so what our more recent efforts have focused on is to try to see if there's ways for the work groups to improve their searchability and to develop the portals in a way that would be picked up more by Google searches and other types of searches to find the portals in general, but then also maybe specific content within the portals. And so the ALI and the CC Hab group has kindly volunteered to be our guinea pigs. And so I had developed a guidance document to provide some input on how the work groups could improve their searchability for their portals and content on the portals. And so we're using Ali and the CC Hub is kindly taking on that to try to see how we can to try to improve the searchability. So our next steps are once we're waiting to work with the State Board's Division of Information Technology, DIT, and we are having these recommendations that we're wanting to get feedback to see if that's feasible, if it's going to be workable, but using one work group as a kind of a starting point just to see how this might take shape and if it's effective. And so what our plans are is that once we do get the green light from the State Board's DIT, we would have the CC Hub start to implement some of those modifications and then kind of test with the Google Analytics to see are those being effective for improving searchability for the CC Hub portal or the HABS portal. And so if they are, then we're going to kind of adjust and make those recommendations more broader for the other work groups to take part in as well. So that's kind of our next steps, is just try to figure out why are we not, why are portals not being found and the content on the portals being found, using the CC Hub as an example, and then we're going to kind of roll those out with the other work groups. So that's kind of our next steps. Right now, we're just wanting to work with the State Board's DIT to kind of figure out timing for when it's feasible, because they have a lot on their plate. So we want to make sure that we're not overwhelming them. That's part of the reason why we wanted to just use one work group as an example rather than bombarding them with all the work groups on the portals. So, so that's our next step is working with the CC Hub, and we'll probably by the November meeting, the council have something more to follow up on, and also hopefully have the Google Analytics to kind of show the effectiveness of these changes. So that's our first step, but then we're also, as I mentioned, looking for opportunities to try to just have those conversations of broader coordination amongst the work groups. So right now it's been a portal focus, but we're just, it's been useful, I think, for the work groups to just have a venue where the chairs of the work groups and any other members who want to take part are able to have those conversations for coordination that might need to take place. And so, so I think more of those opportunities will come as we continue to meet. So if there's any questions.
Maybe a question, maybe a comment. I've noticed that not all portals are created equal, and certainly that not all work groups are as active as others. And so, you know, while you might put the right bells and whistles on one to get a lot of hits, if we don't reinvigorate the few that are not really that active anymore,
yeah, then
it won't help a whole lot. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do have a few efforts that part of which we'll be discussing today of some of the work groups that are not as active that we're hoping to reinvigorate. And so I think there are opportunities that I think we're hoping to get some of those work groups more active to address some of those needs, but that's definitely a good point in terms of the work groups that are still not meeting, and how do we address those for the portals that are maybe not well staffed. So we'll try to keep that on our radar, and that may be something where, you know, Nick and I may work together to try to help to try to make some of those modifications if, you know, as we can. So.
Yeah, and that also ties in a lot with what we were talking about with our overall strategy subcommittee about finding a way to assess and audit the portals in general, and then determine, okay, is a work group or a subcommittee even is longer needed any longer? You know, meaning has the information, is it being provided and being updated in a satisfactory way that doesn't require a work group, and if so, then it's a maintenance type of role, or in the case of, say, Safe to Drink, where another kind of we just link to another agency. Is that the way we want to go? So I think that will be that independent audit included with the self-assessment of the work groups will allow us to kind of gauge, you know, which ones we need to pursue and which portals are actually of value and need continued support versus maintenance.
That was a point that's actually a good point that came up, was there are some of the work groups that were actual work groups that have portals, but then there are also portals such as the ocean and coastal content that we have on the portals that never really have been an active work group of the council. It's been where we've linked to groups like Marine or other groups, portals. And so that may be something that we may want to think about too in terms of referencing the portals. If it's something where if we do have active participation, maybe having links to relevant other efforts that, you know, are something that we may want to reference, so that we don't give the perception that maybe they're a workup of the council or a portal of the council. So those are some of the discussions that did come up, and we haven't really solidified any kind of approach for that, but that may be something that we may want to think about in terms of a general approach that we might want to take moving forward.
I was just curious about the choice to kind of work on one portal, promoting, you know, working with one portal. When the My Water Qualities, you know, if you get there, you see everything. So especially if it's somebody who, I mean, if it's somebody who's already looking for a portal and is having trouble finding it, but if it's somebody who's just like, I just did some searches and it seems like My Water Quality popped up. Of course, maybe my Google knows what I'm looking for. So
if you've gone there before, I think that may make a difference too. Yeah, we did find that was something that for people who regularly go to certain websites, that Google is more likely to find those. But your point is well taken. What we did discuss also as another action item was we have another meeting that's scheduled in November. And one of the things that I'll be helping to lead an effort to try to work with the subteam to try to rethink how the My Water Quality homepage is, you know, how the information can be accessed through the homepage, and then also through other kind of ecosystem health pages and you know, other content on the portals. And so just trying to think through and propose some updates that maybe are a little bit more intuitive and maybe address some of the interconnectedness of some of the different portal efforts. That's been something that came up, is that there are different portals that, whether, like CCHAB is a good example, there's relatedness to the estuary work group or the Safe to Swim group. And so there's maybe things that for those portals and content on portals that cross across multiple themes that we may want to think about how that information is presented in maybe a more intuitive way. And so what we'll do is we'll have a discussion with the sub-team, maybe make a proposal and then bring it back to the council to kind of get feedback and guidance on, you know, this seems to be a direction that the council's supportive of, and maybe provide some opportunities for us to kind of modify our course. So, yeah, thank you.
It may also be useful to get Ray's people's paragraphs.
You've been involved in multiple subcommittees. I don't remember if you were involved in that subcommittee, but that's something that we can definitely, your staff, if you want to send the feedback to Nick and I, we'll make sure to incorporate that into the portal discussions. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think I saved them, but I've got more interns coming, so I can.
Thank you.
Any other questions on subcommittees? Oh.
Do we have?
The Safe to Drink portal. So far we haven't, we've had the Human Right to Water effort has been the connection that we've mainly had for the Safe to Drink kind of portal content, but we haven't really convened a Safe to Drink group necessarily. We did have one that was starting to form a few years ago, but with the drinking water program moved to the state board, we had that on hiatus. But yeah, yeah. Right.
When they moved over here, that plan just stopped.
Yeah.
And so we filled the portal with the Human Rights to Water. Most of the members on that work group are retired.
Yeah.
Gone to other places.
Yeah, so that is something that has come up where we've thought that the Human Right to Water was kind of an effort that was going on within the Human Right to Water effort within the state board, but we are hoping to try to expand that to be maybe including and looping in some of the other folks.
Why don't Karen, Nick, and I, it's a water board conversation, so why don't we talk about how we're going to rebuild the leadership on that. And there's plenty of opportunity. In fact, the Safe Drinking Water Challenge I mentioned earlier is going to produce so many amazing data viz tools and whatever that we may be able to just jumpstart it with some sort of formed group from there. But we would need a leadership head here at the council, and we should probably talk about that offline.
Yeah, and we've got Betsy Lichty here, right behind you, that is from the Drinking Water Program. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I am Betsy Lichty, and I have been working, having discussions with one of my units to begin identifying how we can improve that site. I recognize the benefit for the public, and the Human Right to Water site does not totally provide them the type of information they need. So we are ready to begin engaging with the Monitoring Council on how to build that appropriately.
So would it be timely to propose maybe by the next meeting or the meeting after for the council to have an item where we're discussing those collaborative opportunities and how that might move forward? Is that something that would be an action item?
Let us talk amongst ourselves, and we'll propose an agenda item either for the next meeting or the meeting after.
That'd be great.
I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, the Human Right to Water was the impetus behind that was some work that OEHA was doing, and we sort of put all of our eggs and efforts into that at the time that was being built. There's a new tool for 123 TCP that we're going to be building. There's a lot going on that makes data available. I think it's not sort of packaged all together, and so we'll talk amongst ourselves and come back to the council. Any other questions, comments on subcommittee activities? All right, then moving on to our next item, number 5. This is most related to our Healthy Streams Partnership and our Healthy Streams, or Healthy Watersheds Partnership and our Healthy Streams portal. And if you recall, what we originally pulled together was a bunch of our data from our bioassessment monitoring program and other efforts with US EPA to come up with some maps on, how healthy are our watersheds, and how vulnerable are they to climate change and other potential stressors. And so there's been a connection with this effort over the years in the council, and I think that's one of our working groups and portals that could use some more attention and reinvigoration, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys have been up to. And so with that sort of quasi-tee up, I'm going to hand it over to Jeanette.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm Jeanette Howard from the Nature Conservancy, and thanks, Nick, for inviting Pete and me here to talk about this. Yeah, so Karen said over the years, that is really quite the statement, and it's true. I was just talking to Greg at the break about this too. I mean, things take a while. And so I started at the Nature Conservancy 12 years ago now, and so I'm a freshwater ecologist, came in. We do a lot of planning around, we do conservation planning, and we do lots of good work around that. When I first started there, we did terrestrial planning. So you would get these great, ecoregional plans for the terrestrial system, and then whatever river went through there, you just kind of circle that and say, okay, that's our priority rivers. And so minded that gap for a long time, saying, well, there must be something about freshwater species and freshwater conservation planning in the state, right? Kept looking, minding the gap. So finally, about maybe 7-8 years ago, decided to start filling that gap. And so embarked on this journey over the last, I'd say, 7 years to get to where we are now. So this really is a multi-phase project, and it started out really looking at how do we even, identifying freshwater species in California. So what are the freshwater species we have here in California, conservation status, all of that. The second part was then to map the occurrences of those and determine the patterns of distribution. The third part was then to identify this network, this freshwater blueprint of priority watersheds based on that representation of biodiversity. And I just want to really stress that. This is about the representation of biodiversity. It's not about the best habitat or salmonids or the best restoration opportunities. They're really about how do you represent biodiversity at writ large across these taxonomic groups, and then to characterize the conditions and threats to inform those conservation strategies. So this has been a really big effort. It's taken a long time, and there have been a lot of people involved, and just thank all of these people and many others who have been persistent, patient. We've done this, kind of on the side, didn't have funding for this, just everybody contributing, and it's been a really great collaboration, been a lot of nice people along the way, and so really big thanks to all of you up front. So the first question, what are freshwater species? What we really ran into, and I just met with DFW a couple weeks ago about this, the same thing they're going through. So how do you define what is a freshwater species? Everything relies on water. How do you define criteria for those? So that was what we really set out first to do, was define criteria for these taxonomic groups here. And the criteria for fishes was pretty straightforward, as you could see here. It's just one paragraph. But then when you start moving into things like these invertebrates, you start getting much, bigger definitions and what is a, freshwater invertebrate. And so that was our first step, and that was a really big effort, and I think it was a really great contribution to conservation in the state. We came out in 2013 with this report based on some initial work that we did, relying on NatureServe data to begin with. And really, in June and July, got a number of criticisms from probably people in this room. I know Pete was one of them, a number of other people, which is great. It was great to get those critiques and comments, and we just brought everybody together then and formed this working group in August 2013 to improve it. And that was really, took us on a nice journey, and that's where we are today. So this slide shows kind of this version 1 and version 2 of the database. The version 1 has 1,700 species that relied again on NatureServe for the species list, and you can see here that by relying on just on NatureServe, we've missed a lot of the plants and a lot of the invertebrates. So in version 2, there's almost 4,000 freshwater species in the database, and we relied on, instead of just that one source, which I think a lot of us do rely on NatureServe as kind of our conservation go-to, we relied on 20 different sources for species lists, and then we included birds in this next round. We also included the conservation status of each of these taxa, and so relied on not only state and federal listings, but also looked at conservation evaluations. So, for example, gastropods had put out, there had been a conservation status of gastropods that we were able to collect information from, then to look at, even though they might not be listed officially, their conservation status in terms of experts in the field and other groups. So that was a big contribution as well. So the result of this is that here, this shows all of the taxa in the database, information we could find conservation status information on. So half of the taxa here that were evaluated for conservation status, which was about half of the data and half of the taxa in the database we could find information on status, and half of those are vulnerable to extinction, and only 114 of those, 6%, have legal mandate for protection. So these various colors here show the darkest one are the extinct taxa, the red, the listed, the orange, vulnerable, the kind of gold color, apparently secure, and then the yellow, you can see that aren't evaluated. And so you can see there's kind of a bias on what gets evaluated. As Pete knows, insects and other invertebrates don't get a lot of love around status. So when we look at the endemic taxa then within that database, it's the same story, but really 90% of the 927 taxa are vulnerable to extinction, and only 14% of those have a legal mandate. So again, the same type of pattern. So that was kind of what are freshwater species, what is their conservation status. So then the next step was to figure out, well, where are these things in our state? And we chose to use the HUC-12 as our analysis unit. And we relied on almost 500 different spatial data sources. So instead of just relying on CNDB, for example, and you could see that listed there, we have about 18,000 records from CNDB. We were able to get, millions of records, including GBIF and a number of other museum records. And so we found spatial data, which is great for 61% of all of the taxa, 68% of the endemic taxa, and 90% of the vulnerable taxa, and 100% of the listed species. But we couldn't find information for almost 40% of the taxa, any spatial representation. Looking at the patterns of those, this shows here the all of the taxa. So A is the richness, B shows the percent of those species within a HUC-12 that are vulnerable, and C shows the percent of species that are listed. And so the darker the color, the higher percentage of taxa within those HUC-12s are listed or vulnerable. So that's an interesting look at some patterns. Here is the patterns for the endemic species. So then you see the percent that are vulnerable in the middle. It's just basically the entire state is dark. And then the percent that are listed. So that, we were able to publish that in PLOS a while ago. What year was that? 2015. So that was a nice contribution. The data are available. The data are available on BIOS and also via a database from TNC. So we're able to get this freshwater species database out there into the world. So I'll pause there. If you guys have questions, you want to ask questions now, and then I'll move on to the next part. I was talking pretty fast. Maybe you've heard it before. Okay, so then our third part was then this conservation planning exercise to identify this network of priority watersheds based on, again, representation of biodiversity. So we used for this zonation software, which is a conservation planning software like Marksan. Marksan is used for mostly terrestrial systems, and zonation allows you to include connectivity. So because our river networks are connected, we wanted to use something that had connectivity embedded into it. And so basically you evaluate kind of the representation of species in that analysis unit, the HUC-12, and then it removes the least valuable. So you keep removing until you get to this optimized network of representation of biodiversity in the state. The target taxa for the analysis, we wound up using 3 groups: fishes, amphibians, and reptiles. We weren't able to use our macroinvertebrates in the zonation software because that's only based on occurrence, and we don't have range data yet figured out for the macroinvertebrates, which really hoping that urging Pete to take that on as a next step to use the CSCI and the observed versus expected and really start to determine some range data so we could start representing macroinvertebrates in this. But we initially included it in our in the analysis, and the reviews came back, and the kind of Simon Linke, who's kind of the premier of freshwater conservation planning now, just said, man, I'm sorry, it's a great paper, but we really got to take those macroinvertebrates out. Anyway, so that's why we only have these 3 target taxa. And then the connectivity, again, we wanted connectivity not within just the HUC-12 unit, but connectivity throughout the network. So that was why we chose that. So this is kind of the answer, the endpoint. I don't think there's any surprises here. This is the blueprint that we came up for representation of freshwater biodiversity in the state. The green is priority conservation areas that are building off of already protected areas, and the purple are this kind of new identified network to represent biodiversity in the state. It represents 1,400 HUC 12 units were identified for high conservation value. That's about 34% of California. It includes the range representation for all of the taxa we looked at was about 78% of the entire ranges are represented, 92% for fishes, 51% for amphibians, and 30% for reptiles. So this graph shows kind of that representation, the proportion of the range that was included in the regular protected area network, that green area, versus this kind of proposed new protected or high conservation value areas. So you can see a much bigger proportion of the range of these target groups are actually included with this new kind of blueprint. We then also included the representation of, while we couldn't include them in the analysis, we looked at the representation of these other taxonomic groups and how this new kind of blueprint would be representing these other taxonomic groups. And you can see by family, genus, and species, there's more of a range represented with this new kind of identified network. So that was nice. We also wanted to look at, some of our colleagues are really concerned about habitat, that we weren't including habitat into this, and so we looked at the percent of the existing habitat in the current protected areas and the percent that are would be expanded in this kind of expanded blueprint. And you see that most habitats are better represented in this blueprint than in the already protected area network, except for warm water streams and woody wetlands. But one of the big concerns people had was that the Sierra Meadows might be excluded by just using fishes, reptiles, and amphibians. But what we see is that really it was well represented here. That was a nice outcome for us. So that's the blueprint. And then the final part we did was to characterize the condition and threats, to just look at kind of overarching conservation strategies. So for this, we relied on the healthy streams data, the healthy watersheds data for the condition and the vulnerability, and created an index to look at condition versus vulnerability, and then just have overarching conservation strategies. So A up there shows the condition index of those HUC-12s identified in this blueprint. So the red is representing a lower condition, the blue higher condition. The threat index represents the same. It's I think those indices were fire, climate change, conversion. And then we combine those into an index to look at condition, threat, and just come up with basic kind of conservation strategies, like, if you're high condition and low threat or low vulnerability, you would want to secure and monitor those places. If you were low condition and high vulnerability, you would want to perhaps let the light blue color restore and then mitigate those as conservation actions. We also did put all of this information into some visualization tools. So first, we actually got that paper published too, just in June, in Freshwater Science, this blueprint for California, which is great. It was a Herculean effort to get there. We're really happy we did. And we have the freshwater species database. We also have this blueprint mapping application where you can look at the condition data and the threats data in a web viewer, and actually look at any HUC-12 in the state to be looking at the condition and threats indices. So that's it. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I'm really excited about what y'all are doing, and excited about the opportunity to talk to you. So happy to take questions if you want to, or if you want to wait till the end after Pete. Okay, cool. All right, thanks very much, you guys.
Are you ready? Okay. Okay, well, thanks, Jeanette. That's fantastic. I just have to say before I start that working with Jeanette on this has been a really good example of what I think this group's intent is, to have a highly collaborative effort that advances our, common goals. And it does it in a really, for me, one of the most exciting parts of my career was working on these things, because it's a chance to finally take this data that we've been spending, years and years coming up with, how do we collect it right? How do we make sure the quality is good? How do we capture and share the data? But now it's doing something with the data. That's the whole thing. We didn't collect it to store it. We collected it to use it. And so it's I think a great illustration of that. It's also really exciting because we talked earlier this morning about the currency of enthusiasm, and it really is this. You can go a long way on that, It's not you can't get 100% of the way there, but it helps, I think, invigorate these types of efforts to have that. And so Jeanette's been just great to work with, and her, she mentioned that the initial work that came out with the Freshwater Atlas got some pushback, and it's true, there was some pushback to it, but I think what I really took away from it and really appreciated was how receptive, you and your group were to, taking that and running with it. Say, okay, let's take that and let's make, round two that much better, and it did, and it was, I think, really great. So let's see if I can make this thing work here. So, okay, so I've got maybe 10 minutes of slides. I'll try to go through it pretty quickly. Mostly I want to talk about this from the perspective of the bioassessment program in SWAMP, and what it, how this work intersects our program at several different ways. And so it does it both, just with the data, as a way to work with the data that we've produced, but also it intersects really well with the Healthy Watersheds program. So I think we want to talk about that when we leave there. So hopefully I'll set that up. So, okay, California Dreamin'. So I gave a talk at the Freshwater Science meetings in Detroit this spring. This is my title for that. If you know Rafi Mazur, I owe him credit for the title to that one. As I was working on this, I had the Mama Cass soundtrack going in my head. So I didn't give that to Nick to cue up, but you can play it in your head. So just to get everybody on the same page real quick, bioassessment is the direct measurement of ecosystem health from the organisms that occur there naturally. So this could be fish, invertebrates, algae, riparian vegetation. There are a lot of different things that we could look at. We like these because they respond to many different types of stressors in the water body, and they integrate impacts over different time scales, and they do so throughout a watershed. So there's a ton of information potentially there to mine. And so the SWAMP program for, gosh, it's been 12, 13 years now since SWAMP really, my lab's been working on this for 20 years. SWAMP has been working on it for 12 or 13 pretty earnestly, and put a lot of investment in over the years into this, developing the ability to work with this type of data. We put a lot of effort into standardizing the field and lab methods, how we manage the data, the quality assurance, all that stuff. We've been working on, I mentioned you could look at a lot of different assemblies or different types of data. We've been working on trying to advance our ability to do that across multiple things. Benthic invertebrates are the big one. Most of our investment has been there, but we put a lot of work into benthic algae. If you're familiar with CRAM, the riparian vegetation in that setting, a lot of work on that as well. Not so much on fish, although there's some potential feelers out there, especially on the DNA side, that may help us on that front. We've also been working on multiple water bodies. Again, most of our work has been in wadable streams, but we've been pushing a lot in non-perennial streams, but also a little bit in large rivers and lakes and depressional wetlands and things like that. And also there's some additional work on causal assessment. Once you find impairment, associating that impairment with different sources, different stressors. So a big message to all this is that we use this stuff. Another area that the program is working and water boards are working is using this information to set targets for policies that relate to these stressors, so hydrologic alteration, physical habitat integrity, nutrient enrichment, et cetera. But that's not really what I want to talk about today. I mean, all that stuff is there, and we've put a lot of effort into that over the years. But really, where we are now, I've been thinking a lot, as a program about the future. Where do we need to be investing? What should we be thinking about if we want to be effective in this? So we've put a lot of work into building the baseline. We've got a bunch of technical advances, scoring tools now. And these give us a good basis for an objective basis, I should say, for quantifying things that we want to do as resource agencies, like impacts of disturbance, being ready to detect and monitor for climate change, impact of fires, drought, et cetera. But ultimately, our goal is bigger than any of those things. What we want to do is get to a point where we're using these measures of ecological integrity as really the most important information, the way we prioritize protection and restoration of water bodies and watersheds. Because this information is so powerful, we're still not using it quite to the potential that we could. We could be exploiting this much more than we are. So, as I say, we've made a lot of progress on these technical elements, but I think if we ask ourselves, if we continue to make progress on these technical pieces, there's a lot of work to be done. We could continue to spend a lot of productive time there. But if I ask myself, is that going to get us eventually, if we just continue to do that, will we have achieved the vision? I think the answer is no. I think there's another big piece that we haven't put a lot of effort into yet, and that is making this information easier for managers to use and work with. And that's the work that Jeanette just talked about as an example of that. But there's some other things going on that have happened, and that's my big message today is I'd like to see us do a lot more of that. So, my dad was a college professor, but he was a bit of scatterbrained, kind of like I am. And he had a quote on his door. It was this guy. He said, when a man's knowledge is not in order, the more of it he has, the greater will be his confusion. I think that's kind of where we are in environmental monitoring a lot, is that we've got a ton of information, more and more every day. It's accelerating really rapidly. But our ability to do stuff with it is not keeping pace. We haven't been putting a lot of effort into the tools that will help us interpret and make decisions from that information. So I think if we're going to be successful, we need to think about water body health across a bunch of different spatial scales, and we need to integrate. We need to be able to integrate the information better than we are right now. As an ecologist, it's kind of fundamental that addressing ecological questions requires you to look at patterns at different spatial scales, and looking for spatial patterns across a landscape within watersheds, et cetera. But we don't really have any tools for doing this in a structured way. We're doing it in a way that we can communicate easily with managers about shared prioritization, for example. And so we've been working on some tools to do this. I'm going to talk about today, focus on an example from the work that we did with the Healthy Watersheds, or the Healthy Streams project. But there's a couple others as well. A big message, though, behind all this is that I think if we're going to be successful in using these types of ecological tools to make decisions on land use decisions, resource management across a large landscape, we're not going to be doing it as one agency or one program in an agency. It has to be across agencies and coordinated across agencies. And to do that, you need some type of framework for doing that in a consistent way that people understand what went into it, so that they interpret what comes out of it. And that's really what was behind the EPA's Healthy Watershed Program. I'll talk about that in a second, but I want to insert a couple things that you guys may not be as aware of. There's similar, or at least related, things happening on the Fish and Wildlife side. Fish and Wildlife has been collecting, documenting its biodiversity for decades. Maybe doesn't do it quite as well as I'd like to, and has been traditionally really weak on the aquatics side, really pretty good on the terrestrial side. They've got I don't know, how many of you are familiar with the BIOS system? Okay, so several of you. That's the kind of the clearinghouse for all of that data. There's a link to that is something called the California Natural Diversity Database, where all these records of species distributions and ranges are stored. That's been there for a while. But one thing that's been happening in the last maybe 5 to 10 years is a program called ACE, the Areas of Conservation Emphasis, which is similar in some ways to the Healthy Streams work that we did, the Healthy Watersheds work. It takes data sets, mostly focused on biodiversity, and it rolls them up into summaries, and it maps it similarly to the way that Jeanette did for the freshwater biodiversity. Again, most of their data is terrestrial heavy, so it's plant distributions, birds, mammals, etc. But they're starting to get more on the aquatic side, and as they do, there's I think some real opportunities for this group to engage with them. So when Jeanette and I met with our biogeographic data branch, to introduce some of these things, there's interest there. There's not a lot of bandwidth to take on new stuff, but there are some new people leading those programs that are definitely interested in working together. So there's opportunity. So let me just introduce the Healthy Watersheds Initiative just in a few slides. I'll go through it pretty quickly because I think several of you have probably seen it, but just so everyone's on the same page. The idea behind the EPA's Healthy Watershed Initiative was to come up with a structured way of summarizing information about the health of water bodies and watersheds across the landscape, and to do that in a consistent way from state to state. So they had some initial pilot studies. California got to be one of them, thanks to Terry. And so we participated in that. Karen, I know, was involved in that back in the days. This is 2011, I think, is when this started. So it's been a little while. That work started then. It was a pretty short turnaround. They did it was almost like a proof of concept. Like, this is how you could take all those different types of environmental data and roll it up into maps of direction. So I'll show you how that works. There's a report probably many of you have seen, is that the technical report that came out of that, done by the Cadmus group, summarized that stuff. So all the details about methods are all in there. But in short, it went like this. They have six different indicators of watershed health. So they're looking at landscape condition, water quality, habitat, hydrology, and then biological condition. The way that they would summarize the data is they would take, some of the data is already spatial, like in the sense that it has, like, so for example, percent of a watershed that is eroded, or road density, or different land use types, things like that. But a lot of the data types were point data, like our biological data was points on streams, right? So to turn that into, to map that to the state, or to areas in the state, they essentially predicted the macroinvertebrate condition at all hucks in the state, based on relationships that they saw between where we did have data and the land use in those watersheds. That kind of makes sense. So when they made the map on the right there, blue is better, yellow is worse condition, and so they have a prediction essentially for every huck in the state, even though we hadn't monitored every huck in the state, but it's based on those relationships that we saw elsewhere. So they did this. We did this for a whole bunch of different things, all those, these multiple indicators we looked at. So in this example, we looked at watershed condition. We're rolling up land cover. What else is in here? Sedimentation risk, information about how much hydrologic alteration is existing, and here road crossing densities. So those things were taken and then modeled for the state and then rolled up into summaries. So those summaries then were used to map this overall condition of the watershed. So without looking at the biology now, so this is just a condition based on physical factors. And so they did the same thing, so that's the one on the left. They did the same thing for our biological condition and, I should say stream health indicators, where we had the bug data, but also some data about nutrients and some physical habitat data went in as well. So they have stream health indicators, watershed condition indicators, and then the stuff that Jeanette showed earlier on watershed vulnerability. So you get, at the end of this, you get these maps that look like this. There's one for, watershed condition, vulnerability, and this one on stream health. So the reason that those gray areas exist on there is because we didn't have enough confidence we didn't have enough representation of data in those sites to be able to model them with anything other than garbage as output. So we deliberately excluded this. But then we take that data, and just as Jeanette did, this is actually Jeanette's slide, but we had a very similar process where you map areas of vulnerability compared to condition, and you can come up with a grid, a contingency plot like that one, where you can say, okay, for areas that have good condition and high vulnerability, then those are ones that we should be putting our efforts into restoration and mitigation. And for sort of low vulnerability low condition, or high condition rather, we should be protecting those areas and monitoring them. So similar type of structure is what we talked about using. So that program, we had that initial push in the group, and we met several times afterwards. And this work group has sort of stalled out for probably 4 years or so, 3 or 4 years. It's probably not been especially active. So I think there's a lot of potential still here. There are other agencies that are probably ripe for coordination right now. So it's a good. I'm glad that the group is starting to think about gearing up again, because I think it's a good chance to do that. I think I'll just, and we can talk. So happy to answer any questions about any of that stuff, or we can just start talking.
So I just want to provide a little context on the water board's function on this topic. About a year ago, as you know, Pete, thank you for all of the presentations. They're fantastic. And as you know, I have a strong interest in telling better watershed stories about California's health and vulnerability and what have you. So, but about a year ago, plus we held a workshop. Brock actually facilitated it. And we spent 2 days sort of hammering out different conceptual models for how you might want to go about combining different types of data to tell stories about health of watersheds. The results of that have been sort of summarized, but we had actually considered working further with Brock and Eric Bernson, the co-facilitator, to develop some products that would be, maybe a range of like an article, a guidance document, or some sort of summary thing. And then the next step was to really start finding some pilot areas. So we also, unfortunately, we lost Brock, but we also had Lori Weber transition out of her job into a new job. So we had a vacancy in my shop, but we're not stopping it. Allie Dunn is the new swamp leader and has been involved in this project from the beginning. We have a pilot project in Bishop. We have another pilot project considering somewhere else, maybe. I don't remember. But I know that the team has been out, including me, to Bishop to talk to them about how they want to sort of use that conceptual model to talk about the health of that watershed, Bishop Creek, I think it was. So there is some progress with the water board that's trying to link that, but I really love the idea of sort of continuing to have this conversation and bring in all the different types of data sets and sort of start to make sense of the two fronts, the conceptual model of how to do this generally, so that you have a consistent way of telling health of watershed stories across California, regardless of whether it's a LA basin or a whatever basin, but also just seeing the real examples of getting better and better at telling the stories and seeing it feed into this. Thank you for the presentation and the energy.
So I agree with Greg. It's all very good work. I'm curious to know from either Jeanette or Pete what you think the council could or should do to help this process along. Right, so I'm going to take what you said and I'm going to try and translate it. So I heard 4 things that you'd like to see happen, whether the council can do it or not, I don't know. First one was you wanted some funding for more tool development. Second one I heard was access to more data. Third I heard was play or somehow put in front of the public or managers this data to information. And the fourth thing I heard was to empower managers to work for. I capture that well enough? So.
Project was wrapping up a few years ago. There was we knew there were limitations to what we were doing. It was a pilot study, essentially. But if we wanted to keep it going, we knew we needed to there's some work we needed to do in the next iterations. And one of them was we needed a mechanism to test and improve what we were doing. We knew this is the first iteration. There's new information coming out all the time, and we need a way to capture that. And as it improves, we need a feedback mechanism to make better models and make better predictions. Where are the models working well? Where are they not? How to coordinate it with existing monitoring programs to do that. We needed a mechanism to add and revise data that were in those. This is the part that you're summarizing, Ken, is we needed a way to make it useful. If we wanted people to play and to partner with this thing, the problem with having a lot of different people from the ground up having their own goals, they have a common maybe final goal, but they have all these intermediate goals that aren't necessarily shared, right? And so we needed a way, if we were going to use this, we called it the super toggle, a way of that people could use these tools but turn on and off different layers as they saw fit. Say, I want an assessment that has, maybe I don't care about biodiversity. Maybe I just care about these other factors, or maybe I mainly care about biodiversity. I don't care about water rights issues, or I don't care about nutrients or something like that. So the ability to do that was a key. But I think the structure's there. I mean, I think it's technically not that hard to do this type of work. It's just how do you get buy-in from people that this is something that they would want to use? That was I think that's the biggest hurdle we had when we were asking for funding, was that we didn't have a clear demonstration that there were people that would use it, that would pick it up and use it. I mean, we had this vision that, if we build it, they'll come, but they don't always come to the cornfield that we're building.
So I'll just add, I think, Pete, when you talk about the technical stuff, it's not important to this group. What's important to this group is, sort of the vision of where we're going and how it is consistent with what the Monitoring Council is all about. And the Monitoring Council is all about, bringing together disparate information, which this accomplishes. It's all about sort of making decisions on how to communicate these things, and this is sort of directly in that wheelhouse. I think the challenge is there's been a lack of support by the Monitoring Council for this stuff, and I think that's the ask. It's, is this important or is this not important? I personally think it is important. I think it's important as we deal with water rights. I think it's important as we deal with, land development. I think it's important for a number of things that these agencies deal with, and for us to not support, I think, would be a disservice. But that's just me speaking as the liaison.
And I agree. I think that much of the work that this represents is exactly what the council should be doing. I think that taking the next step, though, too, is how do we as agencies then take that information and use it for our programs?
Well, I think that's where the use case thing would be a very useful thing, a nice exercise. But I think it takes more than these two to think about it.
Agreed.
And it may take people that represent different agencies to work with these guys to do it. And maybe that's the ask for today.
So I was involved in the 1755 use case development, and I've been watching it sort of play out. The work it takes to do an inventory of use cases is significant. It's not undoable, but it's significant. And then there's work to be done after you've even done that initial inventory. So, for example, we lobbed up a few use cases to that effort, and now they're getting ready to build test beds to sort of plot them out. But are we, as an agency, ready to commit to fleshing out the details of each one of those use cases? When you talk about watershed data and watershed decision-making, there's thousands of use case potential sitting right around this corner of the table. Not to mention if you expand it out to local governments and other people sitting in the room. So the real challenge to me, it seems like somebody has to do a heavy lift on an inventory of potential use cases and then strategically recommend to the council what are the ones that are ripe and ready that we can have an executive sponsor here sort of back. Because that's the other thing is you need a champion that is willing to sort of go through a lot of difficult waiting period to see does the data actually arrive when you say I want a use case tool to inform my stormwater permit decision making or whatever the process is. So it takes executive commitment and sponsorship. It won't just happen overnight. But I think if you sort of leverage the work that 1755 is doing in building some of the infrastructure, it gets easier because it sort of floats all the different data up to a higher level. And there's a lot of leveraging that you could do off of that if you guys want to. Well, so the UC team that did it, they held a series of probably 4 workshops. At least 2 of those were all day long. And then in between each workshop, they did a lot of outreach working with each person who was proposing a use case. They whittled down something like 100 and something potential use cases into the final 20 that they recommended. My guess is that it was thousands of hours. I could find out though. It was a grant or somebody paid for it, I think.
You know, I guess there are use cases and there are use cases, right? So I mean, I think the stuff that 1755 is going to be a lot deeper than I think what I would envision for this group.
Right, but let me just give you one example of a use case that I lobbed up that made it into the final was the harmful algal bloom decision-making use case, which I thought was relatively safe to lob up as an agency executive because we're already doing it. The feedback that we got when it showed up in the final document was there's so many more things that people are working on about harmful algal blooms that fall into this, and this is way too focused on simply incident reporting for the public's interest. You know, so then you have that same problem. You're going to run into this with watershed stuff. It's like, well, it's kind of close to what I want, but you're just going to need to add some fish data or a interest that's very unique to me in my county of whatever, right? So keeping that refereed, but also just doing the harmful algal bloom incident one that I threw up, it took up a significant amount of time to write it up, develop it, and think it out. And it's still not being fleshed out to this day. We're doing it because as an agency, you know, I'm pointing over at Nick, but it's really Nick and Allie and Marissa. A lot of people are doing this because they're committed to informing the public about health of a watershed or the harmful algal bloom. But it's not building out this data decision-making life cycle that you guys want to see happen with watersheds. It's a very circular thing that's focused on doing its job of informing the public pre-holiday and things like that. So my point is there's a lot of work to get to the point of building it, and then there's a lot of work to get through the whole process. And it's going to take probably a significant amount of resources from agencies that are able to commit it around this table to make it work.
So we're in the chicken and the egg thing where it sounds like a good idea, but it needs funding, but we don't know if we can get the funding until the managers are going to use it, but the managers don't know if they're going to use it until they have it.
Yeah, and that's my message is that use cases sound good, but they're not an easy button by any means. And the build the dream model is also not easy. There is no easy, right? So, but it's a matter of deciding, I think strategically, it might be a little bit of both. I think maybe keep building up some sort of a dashboard of information about healthy watersheds on the My Water Quality website as the build a dream model, and maybe decisions will come to it, right?
So you're going to the same place that I'm going. Is there an interim step we can take that's going to accomplish our shorter term goals, like get the Healthy Watershed group kind of reinvigorated. Small step, even if it's not statewide, can we do it some smaller spatial scale?
One reason I saw this presentation at a TNC event, and it got me excited about it, and I saw a direct correlation with the 303D assessments and feedback that I constantly got while I headed up that program. Is it's always 2, 3, 5, 6 years behind schedule of what the data is currently saying, and this could provide an opportunity to turn data into information in a quicker fashion, so that somebody, maybe not in the regulatory sense, but somebody could go and go into a visualization and say, what's my water body look like, or what's my watershed look like now, based on the data that's currently available, whether that be on opendata.ca.gov or on the CNRA website, and it would be able to visualize that, whether it be a red, green, or yellow, and be able to allow you to dig deeper. That was kind of the basic kind of framework that I was seeing in my mind as a need that I constantly heard from several stakeholders, whether that be the regulated community, whether that be agency people, because I always heard the feedback, oh, well, the integrated report is there, but it's so old. What's the data really telling me now? And this seemed to me one simple way to kind of get at that simple, complicated question, but that's something that seemingly everybody wants to know on some form or another. And I was hoping that the council could say yes, that we agree, and that we can look at where we can find our partners. We also have new people like the Department of Forestry who's doing something similar with forestry watersheds. I don't know if you want to talk about what you're doing, but I feel like there's a nexus, like Pete said, across multiple agencies that this could interplay with and be powerful to communicate to secretaries and the legislature and get their attention.
Hi, I'm Loretta Moreno with the Department of the Natural Resource Agency, 2 months in, so a little new to the state. But I work with Dr. Russ Henley, and he is the Assistant Secretary of Forest Resource Management for the agency, and I was brought on to help implement a portion of AB 1492 legislation, which has to do with timber regulation forest restoration program. And my mandate is to focus myself on development of ecological performance measures and associated indicators and assessment of timber resources across the state. Coniferous and mixed coniferous forests is our overall focus. And I think there's a lot of overlap with what you're trying to continue moving forward, and we have a requirement to link the indicators, the assessment we do, to management action and potential changes over time. So I think this is a brand new effort. It's been called for since 2012, but I've just got brought on. So I think this is a nice opportunity to link the efforts and not be redundant with existing approaches. But we have, like, the FRAP, for example, the FRAP assessment, very good assessment, but it doesn't get at that ecoregional watershed scale. We're still not settled on the scale, and there's a lot of decisions coming in the next year about how we structure the program. But I would love to work with you all to coordinate this.
We don't have a champion for healthy watersheds, or do we? Are you the champion?
I would like to be. So, this is really something that we've been pushing, OEMA hard since I came on board. And actually, it's interesting, the nexus was we saw legislation that was starting to describe different assessment protocols. And some were legislative, some were being used just, like Region 3 had its thing. So we were really trying to do the work of comparing different conceptual models in that workshop a year and a half ago, and it was based on that. And I really do think SWAMP and OEMA, the data storytelling component of the water boards, is a great place for the watershed health champion. We've tried putting it in programs before, and it's not there anymore. It went to funding because it became an important way to sort of give out money. But even then, it's like not clear anymore where the watershed management initiative is today. But I would like to make the argument that the water boards, it could be a OEMA thing.
I'll step up and for particular application lends itself well to Stormwater Monitoring Coalition region. I'll talk with you after our meeting, and you too, Allie. And so a lot of data and a lot of the condition index stuff is going to be time. And so they're looking for opportunities to turn their data to volunteer to explore that opportunity and move it forward.
I think that's great. It's a great history of stuff being done there already with watershed storytelling and use and decision making. So yes, but I think that's a really good perspective to keep reminding the council that's why they wanted to champion this. Because I mean, if we didn't do anything at the council level, SMC would be developing watershed tools and decision making anyway. This becomes a place to sort of argue for that, and your voice at Swamp and my voice in OEMA might help bring it to the rest of the state. But, I mean, it actually does have a history related to decision making too, as we know with the biointegrity project. And really, you know, I think it was your point that we focus on the regulated areas, but we have this incredible pressure on the parts of the state that aren't discharger funded or have stakeholders that pay for fees at our organizations. And so we have to figure out a way to tell stories and do the work that's expected of our agencies, even without that. And this is the right place, I think.
Well, and I can think of a number of use cases that are just related to my programs that I run as the head of DWQ at the State Water Board. So, you know, I would like to enter into the conversation about how can we make it a statewide, how can we use it? I mean, we've already used the data, not all of the data that was presented, but much of the data that Swamp has collected to identify where we've got water bodies that aren't impaired, that are in Category 1. And we've put water bodies in Category 1 for the first time in what year? 20?
It's never done before. Well, it was done for the first time.
For the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, that's one area where we've pushed forward, and of course the bio objectives is near and dear to my heart, and while you might all think it's dead, it's not.
And there's also a slew of water bodies that are insufficient information, which I think is another part where we fill those data gaps, and that's an opportunity where we're missing out on, that people just need to be data-lit. So I feel like there's such a big nexus with what this council is supposed to be charged to do that it makes, like Terry said, it'd be a disservice if we didn't, you know, put some effort behind it to at least get it back on track.
Well, right. First time, this is the third round of doing that area. Highly terrestrial. We weren't looking at watersheds, we're looking at polygons. Out of quiet stuff. They brought it all. That's now all in apartments. They're ready. You know, there's a chance for the. It's the kind of thing you have to have multiple conversations about it a little bit, and they come and hear it again and think about it. Like eventually, like you fall down. That's the.
Yeah, there's lots of, I mean, the LA River flows is using the data that we're talking about right here, at least portions of it. So there's lots of use cases that I think if we sat down and really kind of thought it through, we could come up with a lot and generate some interest from that.
Thinking the same thing, and I would look to you or both of you, say who's the right person, and and I are thinking about doing it.
Yeah, and I would even say elevate it to the conversation about council membership, because an observation that I've had all along is this is people that are subject to fees or people in charge of regulating people who are paying fees. And so with exception, I'm not trying to offend the two committee or two seats that are meant to be open, but there's no state agency here that really has the charge of protecting the resources on a holistic level for the state. We all have sort of very focused water-related jobs that tend to be more towards the regulatory community.
Okay, so when are you guys going to meet and report back?
Well, I would be offering up Allie's time because it was in Lori's duty statement anyway. So Allie can schedule a meeting, and we could probably schedule something between now and the next council meeting. But I'll have her work with you and anyone else.
Volunteer. Yeah, Terry needs some work to do, I heard over lunch. All right, that sounds good. I'm excited. Thank you for coming out and all right, the last item on our agenda is to plan for our next agenda, which is our meeting is November 29th. We have some strategic planning items listed here for potential agenda items from strategic planning, report back from the communications subcommittee, ramp tools to support climate change adaptations, Safe to Swim portal update, environmental flows work group update, potentially discussion of an annual conference that the Monitoring Council could put on. Nick, do you have a sense of which of those will be ripe for a November meeting?
I'm hoping the Safe to Swim portal update would be a great one. I've heard several action items today about reporting back, including the item we just had, as well as, it's safe to drink. Again, the communication and strategy updates seem to be consistent across. I'd also say the environmental flows work group should have their website up and running by that time. So those two, for sure, should have something tangible for the council to see and potentially comment on.
Well, I've got an important item to suggest. During the May 30th meeting, I brought to the council's attention that the Safe to Eat portal was giving some misinformation about which fish are safe to eat, with a specific example of a species of fish off Palos Verdes that is a do not eat species due to high levels of PCBs, DDTs, and mercury. And on the Safe to Eat portal, it's listed as unlimited eating. And we've had 2 calls with the bog folks and gave numerous suggestions how to fix it. And it's something that needs to be, it's very important that it gets done immediately, unless we know that no one's going to the portal. So maybe it's not important if no one's looking at it, but I would like to see a presentation of the revised portal. If it's not possible, then maybe just take it down, take that portion down. It's a public health issue.
Shelley, is the issue that the portal has the OEHA fisheries warnings, right, advisories, and then it also has information that's based on samples that they caught. Is it that both of these are being presented in different ways? Is that the issue?
Exactly.
Okay.
And this specific example is one sample, one composite sample of 10 fish in 2008 that was really low. Even at the time, we thought, wow, that's really low compared to what we've been seeing. It was a bite sample, and it's lower than any other fish that we've seen in the area.
So I'm going to suggest that is probably not a monitoring council issue. It is just something that the bog should work out because, it seems like it should be fixed, right? And I don't think we need to talk about it forever to
No, I just want to see it. It's on our website, so I want it off if it's not going to be an issue.
Jay Davis is on the phone, and we've had discussions with him. He had some personal issues where it got off, but he definitely has this on the agenda for the next bog meeting to discuss with the larger group as a whole on potential ways to remedy this, whether it's just the messaging on the way the certain visualization that Shelley's referencing should just not reference the OEHA advisories, or a way to indicate that this is a specific monitoring event and should not be taken to say that you can eat the fish from this location. It's just, I think it's a messaging issue that we should be able to remedy fairly easily once SPA gets a chance to comment on it. But their meetings were canceled, and so their next meeting is on their agenda.
I'm curious why. I mean, there's a messaging issue, but there's also sounds like there's data that's not being presented. If you have other data that indicates that that same fish species is not safe to eat, then shouldn't those data be being
has the
presented
data
too?
EPA has a lot of data. There's a lot of entities that do a lot of bioaccumulation monitoring that don't go into seeding. So that is an issue, I agree.
I do agree with Terry, and I agree with Shelley too. The council should talk about the website that it has its name and charge over, but I also think that there's a bigger looming issue that the BOG program needs to talk about, and it might involve some conversations with OEA and EPA too. Because I've heard about this, and I think we do need to sort of figure out the best way to address some of the underlying data management issues as well as the risk communication on the front end. And at the end of the day, it is sitting on the My Water Quality website.
Karen, is the RAMP, the wetlands regulatory, is that what that is?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
So the item 6C was a suggestion from Josh Collins, just in terms of trying to be thinking of how the wetlands work group and tools that they've been developed could be used for kind of high priority initiatives and something to kind of elevate the use of the tools to support information on climate change and related types of questions.
Well, in the vein of, one ring to bind them all, I mean, it just seems to me the conversation that we had with these two, and then, Jay and his Eco Atlas, I mean, Jay, not Jay, Josh. I mean, it just seems to me that this portal discussion that we've been having has to mesh, because it seems like it's silly to have an Eco Atlas and something completely different that deals with the resources, and maybe that's another discussion that we can have at some point in time.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
So I just was thinking, one, the human right to water conversation that we had a little bit earlier with Betsy, was there a follow-up that would be valuable for the next agenda?
Possibly. I think the talk amongst ourselves needs to happen, but we could certainly report back before November 20th, by the November meeting.
And then my other question was related to some valuable membership questions about existing alternates and those. So it might be helpful if we ask staff to kind of see if there are specific things we need to be acting on as related to alternatives or formalizing memberships, and if it's not an interaction with staff before the 29th, that by the 29th we have some ability to talk about that issue a little more. Because you and I were talking about it, but I just think we don't want to lose sight of that, knowing that both Beth and Shelley had raised more.
I agree. I think we need to come up with a plan to deal with membership, especially if we're going to be engaging with our current agency secretaries. November 29th would be too late.
It's too late, but I think I just wanted to make sure that we didn't lose sight of that in this wrap-up conversation.
Yeah, and we can definitely try to move that forward, because as Karen pointed out, if we are not on the radar of if there are new secretaries, our process would be where we would normally seek out their approval. So it may be a year before we could actually get members confirmed, potentially, if we don't hit this early before the end of the year. So, yeah, thank you.
And as I was sort of packing up, I was thinking about Shelley's issue, and I think the issue has to do with the fact that the BOG portal has the information that they collect and OEHA's advisories, but it doesn't have anything that's collected by the dischargers. It doesn't have anything that's collected by EPA. And so that's sort of the bigger issue that I think we need to think about in a BOG meeting.
They don't even have the OEHA data.
They have the advisories.
They're applying the advisories, but they don't have the data that the advisories were built on as part of their data set.
Most of the advisories that they have are based on the swamp data.
I think what I'd like to do is commit to a paper that describes what the issue is, because I've heard bits and pieces of it in my role as the leader of the SWAMP program, but I haven't heard it dissected to the point of clarity. So, and I know that there's, what you're describing, Terry, sounds accurate with what I've heard, and same with what you're describing, but it seems like some sort of paper that says, here's the issue, here's what's happening, here's a recommended suite of alternatives to move forward. And digested and analyzed.
We had OEHA on the call, and they were definitely not in sync with the bog data set.
Okay, so we'll work with Nick and Chris to come up with the agenda for the November.
Sounds like we have plenty of items.
Yes, I agree.
And one other thing, I'll be reaching out to the council members to start scheduling for the 2019 meeting. So in the coming weeks, I'll be reaching out to folks to just kind of identify dates for us to meet next year, so, which we'll be bringing back the November meeting to confirm.
Okay. All right, then I will declare this meeting adjourned.